Section 1. The show that refused to stay dead. There is something almost mythological about how Family Guy came to exist. Not just the show itself, but the whole chain of events. The stumbling and repeatedly interrupted path from a young animator sitting in a college dorm, sketching characters all the way to one of the most controversial programs in the full recorded history of American television. Every step along that path had something unexpected in it. The show shouldn't have survived its first cancellation. It definitely shouldn't have survived the second. And yet here it is, still producing episodes over 25 years after its premiere, generating scandals and arguments and passionate defenses with a consistency that no other animated series has ever quite matched. To understand why Family Guy generated so much controversy across so many decades, you have to go back to the beginning and understand what it was trying to be, who built it, and what the specific circumstances were that shaped both its content and its creative culture. Because the controversies that followed weren't accidental. They grew out of something deliberate, a point of view, a specific kind of irreverence that was baked into the show from the very first episode. Seth MacFarlane was born in 1973 inches Kent, Connecticut. He was the kind of child who drew constantly and obsessively, the way some children play sports or collect things. He drew characters, invented little worlds, created ongoing stories with recurring figures. There was never really a question about what he was going to do with his life. He was going to make animation. The question was just how he was going to get there. He enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most respected art programs in the country and has produced an unusual number of people who ended up in the entertainment industry. He was studying filmmaking and animation, learning the technical side of the craft while simultaneously developing his own voice as a writer and creator. And while he was still in school, working on student projects, he made 2 short animated films that would become the foundation of everything that followed. The films were called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. They featured 2 characters, a heavyset man named Larry and his talking dog Steve. If you watch those films today, the connection to Family Guy is immediate and obvious. Larry walks, talks, and feels like an early sketch of Peter Griffin. Steve is clearly the template for Brian. The humor is raw and unpolished in the way that student work tends to be, but the sensibility is already there. Something in those characters worked in a way that MacFarlane clearly recognized, because he kept coming back to them even as he moved on with his career. After graduating, he went to work at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary studio behind the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and dozens of other classic animated properties. He worked on Johnny Bravo, on Cow and Chicken, on Dexter's Laboratory. These were legitimate working animation credits, and working on them gave him both technical skills and practical experience in the day-to-day reality of producing animation for television. He was 23 years old, writing jokes and drawing characters for shows that millions of children watched every week. And the whole time, Larry and Steve were sitting in the back of his mind, slowly evolving. By 1997 and 1998, he had developed those 2 characters into something substantially more complete. Larry had become Peter, and around Peter, he had built a wife, 3 children, and a town. He had given the dog a specific intellectual profile, a set of quirks and contradictions that made him interesting to spend time with. He had invented a baby with a British accent who was secretly an evil genius. He had taken the basic setup of a domestic sitcom and pushed it through some kind of creative pressure chamber until it came out the other side as something that felt genuinely different. He pitched this concept to Fox. They gave him money to produce a pilot. The amount was around $50,000, which is very modest even by the standards of the late 1990s. MacFarlane, being the kind of person he was and remains, did an extraordinary amount of the work himself. He wrote the pilot, he directed it. He also sat in a recording booth and performed 4 of the main characters, providing voices for Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Glenn Quagmire. All 4 voices. One man. And the voices were specific and fully realized in a way that demonstrated something beyond mere competence. He was genuinely talented. Fox liked what they saw. They greenlit the series. And on the 31st of January, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, Family Guy premiered on American television. That time slot, immediately following the Super Bowl, is one of the most coveted in all of American broadcasting. Tens of millions of people are already watching. The game has just ended. People are settled in, comfortable, and ready to keep watching something. The first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated series that nobody had ever heard of, that was an enormous number. It was a number that reflected the time slot far more than anything about the show itself, but it also meant that 22 million people had now seen at least a few minutes of this family and their world. The show settled into its premise in those early weeks. The Griffin family of Stoolbend, Rhode Island. Peter Griffin, the overweight, broadly unintelligent but fundamentally good-hearted father who worked at a brewery called the Pawtucket Patriot Brewing Company and spent his evenings with his friends at a bar called the Drunken Clam. His wife Lois, who was patient and warm and considerably smarter than her husband, who played piano and kept the household from collapsing under the weight of Peter's various enthusiasms and disasters. Their teenage daughter Meg, unpopular at school, ordinary, and overlooked within her own extraordinary family. Their son Chris, sweet-natured and a little oblivious, who seemed to float through life without excessive distress about any of it. And then the two characters who would define the show's creative identity more than any others. Stewie Griffin, a baby. 1-year-old, still in diapers, still in a high chair. Who spoke like a Bond villain and constructed laser weapons in his bedroom, and spent a significant portion of his waking hours plotting either the death of his mother or world domination, or some combination of the two. The comedy came from the gap, which was absolute and unbridgeable, between what Stewie looked like and what was coming out of his mouth. Here was this round-headed infant in a yellow shirt, explaining in precise and sophisticated terms exactly how he planned to eliminate all obstacles to his ascension to global power. The adults around him heard babbling. The audience heard a manifesto. Brian Griffin, the family dog, who walked on 2 legs and drove a car and drank martinis and had read more books than anyone else in the house. Brian was the voice of reason in a household where reason was in short supply. He was cynical in a dry, affectionate way, and his friendship with Peter, the dopiest person he knew, was one of the genuine emotional cores of the early show. Brian had his own complications. He was a failed writer who couldn't finish his novel. He drank more than was good for him. He had feelings for Lois that he kept mostly to himself. He was perpetually unlucky in love. He was a real character with actual depth, and having him there gave the show a place to land when the absurdity needed to be grounded. The first season performed well enough. It averaged around 12.8 million households per episode and ranked 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings for the year. For a brand new animated comedy, those were respectable numbers. The show had found an audience that liked what it was doing, and that audience was growing through word of mouth in the way that shows with genuine originality tend to. And then Fox started making decisions that would change everything. During the second season, the network moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening. Thursday at 9 put it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, which was one of the most successful comedies on television and had been for a decade. Frasier had a deeply entrenched audience and enormous brand loyalty. Family Guy, still relatively new and still building its following, was not ready for that fight. The ratings dropped, so Fox moved it again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it went up against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, an ABC game show that was at the absolute peak of its cultural moment. Millionaire was pulling in numbers that most scripted dramas could only dream of. Family Guy got crushed. Fox kept shuffling the show from time slot to time slot across its second and third seasons, seemingly without any coherent strategy for building the audience. Each move disrupted the habits of the viewers who had found the show and were watching it consistently. Each move required a new audience discovery process. The cumulative effect was exactly what you would expect. By the end of the third season, the ratings had fallen far enough that Fox canceled Family Guy in May of 2002. The show was done. That cancellation was the first significant controversy in Family Guy's history, though it didn't look like a conventional controversy at the time. There was no scandal, no offensive episode, no federal agency filing complaints. The controversy was simpler and in some ways more fundamental. A genuinely talented original show had been treated carelessly by a network that hadn't committed to it properly, and an audience that had found something they loved had it taken away from them. The fan response was immediate and sustained. Letters went to Fox. Online communities, which were still relatively young in 2002, organized campaigns to bring the show back. There was a genuine grief in these responses. The kind of grief that only comes when something has actually connected with people, when it has found a place in their lives that they didn't fully realize was there until it was gone. Then something happened that nobody in the television industry predicted. Cartoon Network had purchased the rights to air reruns of Family Guy's first 3 seasons on their Adult Swim late-night programming block. They had acquired these rights for almost nothing because Fox, having canceled the show, had valued those rights accordingly. Nobody expected much from reruns of a canceled Fox cartoon on a late-night cable block. The reruns launched on the 20th of April 2003, and the response was almost instantaneous. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the Adult Swim block. The audience that had followed the show during its original run, plus a significant wave of new viewers who had discovered it through the rerun exposure, was enormous. Adult Swim's overall viewership went up by 239%. 239. The numbers were not slightly better than expected. They were in an entirely different category from what anyone had anticipated. Simultaneously, Fox released DVD sets of the first 2 seasons. These were not a guaranteed success. Canceled television shows didn't automatically translate into DVD sales, but the Family Guy set sold over 400,000 copies in relatively short order. People were buying the show and giving it to their friends. The cult following that had been building in online communities was now visible in sales data that network executives could read and understand. Fox reversed course. By 2004, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice had greenlit a 4th season. New episodes were commissioned. The show that had been written off as a failure was coming back. Fans celebrated this as something that almost never happens, because it almost never does. The television industry doesn't typically reverse cancellations. When a show ends, it usually ends. Family Guy had defied that expectation once, and the return was genuinely momentous. But the comeback carried something within it that would shape the show's second life in ways that only became clear over time. The original writing staff had dispersed during the hiatus years. People had found other jobs, other projects, other creative homes. They couldn't simply be reassembled with a phone call. New writers had to be recruited. New voices entered the writer's room. The tone began to shift, subtly at first, in ways that would become more significant as the seasons accumulated. And the show returned to a media landscape that had changed considerably in the 3 years it was off the air. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy's 4th season premiered. The internet's capacity to spread short video clips rapidly was transforming how people encountered content. A 30-second cutaway gag could be extracted from its episode, uploaded, and watched by millions of people who had never seen the episode it came from. This changed the incentive structure around the cutaway gag format in ways that nobody fully understood at the time. Viral moments, discrete clips that could live on the internet independently, became more valuable than sustained storytelling. All of this together set the stage for everything that came after. The show that returned in 2005 was not quite the same show that had left in 2002. The scandals and battles and arguments along the way are the story of that transformation. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it costs nothing, and it genuinely helps. Now let's keep going. Section 2, the night everything almost ended. September 11th. Before we get into the decades of on-screen controversies, we need to talk about something that happened off-screen. Something that predates most of the show's most notorious moments and that gave its creator a very specific perspective on the randomness and fragility of being alive. Something that, when you sit with it, feels like one of those strange hinge points in history where the course of things almost went in a very different direction. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to fly home to Los Angeles. He had spent the previous day in Rhode Island, his home state, giving a lecture at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design. It was the kind of appearance that someone in his position was regularly asked to make. He had graduated from RISD. He had gone on to create one of the most talked-about animated shows of the past several years, and the school wanted their alumni to see what was possible. He gave the lecture, talked to students, did the thing you do when your school invites you back as someone who made it. After the lecture ended, the way things go after these events, a group of people went out. There were drinks. It got later than was probably wise. He was flying out of Boston the next morning, and Boston was not particularly close, and he had a hangover that was going to make the morning harder than it needed to be. His travel agent had given him the flight details for American Airlines Flight 11, which would depart from Boston's Logan Airport and fly to Los Angeles. What the travel agent had told him, through some combination of miscommunication and clerical error that would later seem almost too perfectly timed to be random, was that the flight departed at 8:15 inches the morning. The actual departure time was 7:45. That 30-minute discrepancy, on top of a hangover and a later-than-ideal start to the morning, meant that Seth MacFarlane arrived at Logan Airport after boarding for Flight 11 had already closed. He got to the gate and was told he was too late. The plane had pushed back. He would have to wait for the next available flight. He went to the airport lounge. He ordered something. He settled into a seat in the way that travelers do when they have unexpectedly found themselves with unplanned time in an airport. He fell asleep. He woke up about 45 minutes later to something that took a moment to make sense of. There was commotion. People were gathered around television monitors. Voices were raised in a way that didn't match the usual background noise of an airport lounge. Something had happened, and the something was continuing to happen as he tried to wake up enough to understand it. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked. The plane had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Everyone on board was dead. The crash had occurred at 8:46 inches the morning, about an hour after the flight's departure. The second plane hit the South Tower at 9:03. By the time Seth MacFarlane was fully awake and processing what the televisions were showing, the United States was in the middle of the worst terrorist attack in its history. The immediate logistical reality of his situation was almost as overwhelming as the larger horror unfolding on the screens around him. He had not told anyone he had missed his original flight. People in his professional life, including his assistant, did not know he was in an airport lounge in Boston rather than on Flight 11. For a period of time, the people who cared about him, who expected him to be on that flight, had every reason to believe he was on it. When a message finally reached his assistant that he had missed the flight and was still alive and waiting for a later departure, that message arrived approximately 20 minutes after the news of the crash had already broken. 20 minutes of not knowing. He told the story in several interviews over the years, most extensively in a long conversation with Howard Stern in 2009. He described every specific element of it with the kind of clarity that comes from a memory that has been gone over many times. The hangover, the late start, the wrong departure time from his travel agent, the gate being closed, the lounge, the nap, the waking up to the commotion, the bartender who poured him a shot when he explained what had happened. He sent his travel agent a basket of alcohol afterward. The error that she made, the 30-minute discrepancy in the departure time, had kept him from the gate. MacFarlane's public statements about the experience have been consistent over the years and notably grounded. He has never described it as a sign that he was meant to survive for some larger purpose. He has never suggested that fate intervened in his favor. He told the New York Times in 2004 that he thought there were probably hundreds of close calls in every person's life every year, moments where one small thing goes differently and the outcome changes completely, and that most of those moments are simply invisible to us. This one happened to be visible. He said he returned to approaching things pretty much the same way he had before. He is, in his own words, not much of a fate person. Actor Mark Wahlberg had also been booked on Flight 11 and changed his plans separately. Wahlberg's response to the near miss became its own minor controversy when he suggested in a 2012 interview that if he had been on the plane, things might have gone differently. He appeared to be implying that he might have been able to physically prevent or interrupt the hijacking. The response to that suggestion was swift and strong, and Wahlberg issued an apology describing his comments as ridiculous. MacFarlane never made any such claim, which was consistent with his broader approach to the subject. There are also some documented discrepancies in the timeline of MacFarlane's account that have been noted by researchers. Official flight records indicate that his reservation for Flight 11 was canceled at 6:34 inches the morning, which would be considerably earlier than when he describes arriving at the airport and being told the gate was closed. MacFarlane's account describes a physical encounter at the gate, arriving to find boarding already stopped. The official records suggest the cancellation happened well before that. These two things are not obviously compatible, though they're also not necessarily irreconcilable depending on how and when the reservation system processed the change. The discrepancy has never been definitively resolved in the public record, and McFarlane's account of the day has remained consistent across multiple tellings over many years. What the experience did to the show, if it did anything, is impossible to trace with confidence. Family Guy was still in hiatus in September of 2001. The third season had aired and the cancellation was coming, though it hadn't happened yet. McFarlane went back to work. The show was canceled. The reruns happened. The comeback came. The later seasons arrived with all their chaos and controversy. Whether a man who had looked at what his life almost became on a Tuesday morning in Boston approached his creative work differently after that day is not something anyone outside his own interior can know. What we can say is that in the years following September 11th, McFarlane became increasingly bold about pushing the content of his shows into territory that made networks and institutions uncomfortable. Whether that boldness was connected to a sharpened sense of time's finitude, or whether it was simply the natural trajectory of a creative person with increasing resources and decreasing deference, the public record doesn't fully answer. Both things are probably true. Section 3. The Parents, Television Council, and the Federal Government. If you want to understand what Family Guy was up against from the moment it returned to the air in 2005, you need to understand the Parents Television Council and the specific kind of institutional power it wielded. The PTC was not just a group of concerned citizens writing letters. It was an organized, funded, strategically sophisticated organization with access to legal mechanisms that could cause real problems for broadcasters. And, from very early in the show's history, it had decided that Family Guy was a primary target. The Parents Television Council was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III, a conservative media critic who had been writing and speaking about what he viewed as the declining standards of American broadcast television for years, before creating a formal organization to do something about it. The PTC's approach was built around a specific legal mechanism. The Federal Communications Commission, which regulates broadcast television in the United States, has the authority to levy fines against broadcasters for indecent content. The law defines indecency in terms of content that depicts or describes sexual or excretory activities in a patently offensive way, as measured by contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium. The FCC can enforce this standard in response to complaints from the public. The PTC understood that the FCC complaint system was, in practice, largely dependent on the volume of complaints received. A single viewer filing a complaint about a program was unlikely to trigger a major regulatory response. A coordinated campaign in which tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of viewers filed complaints about a specific program in a short window was a different matter. The PTC effectively functioned as a complaint-generating infrastructure, providing its membership with the tools, the language, and the mechanism to file formal FCC complaints about programs they objected to. Their membership, at their claimed peak, numbered over 1 million people. Family Guy attracted the PTC's attention almost immediately after its original 1999 premiere. The show was animated, which meant it looked like children's programming. It aired during primetime family viewing hours, and its content, with its sexual humor, its violence, its mockery of religion and disability and race, was by conventional standards inappropriate for children. The PTC's argument was that a show dressed up as a cartoon but filled with adult content was a particular kind of trap, one that could expose children to material they weren't equipped to process before their parents even realized what they were watching. McFarlane's response to the PTC, across various interviews and public statements over the years, was mostly dismissive with occasional flashes of genuine irritation. He described them as a group whose fundamental position was that they should have the right to determine what all of television's audiences were permitted to watch, regardless of individual preference. The correct mechanism for objecting to a show's content, in his view, was to change the channel. Not to file federal regulatory complaints aimed at removing the content from the airwaves for everyone. The PTC labeled Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on more than 40 separate occasions over the course of the show's history. They filed formal indecency complaints with the FCC against at least 7 specific episodes. They urged their membership to file additional complaints in coordination with their own filings, which is what produced the truly extraordinary numbers in certain cases. The episode that generated the largest single complaint campaign was Family Gay, which aired on the 8th of March 2009. The seventh season episode featured Peter Griffin becoming temporarily gay through a medical experiment, depicted an extended orgy scene, and included a scene where Stewie sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, as Peter explained that some of the milk in the refrigerator had been replaced with horse semen from Peter's brief attempt at horse breeding. This was typical Family Guy territory. It was crude. It was deliberate. It was the show being exactly what it had always been. The PTC filed a formal FCC complaint citing, in their own press release's language, bestiality, orgies, and babies eating sperm. Their president, Tim Winter, called the episode an example of the most graphic and gratuitous content ever broadcast in prime time. He then sent an action alert to the organization's membership urging them to file their own FCC complaints. The number that came in was 188,368. 188,000 complaints about a single episode of a single television show in a relatively short window. That is a number that requires some context to appreciate. The FCC had received 43,000 total television complaints in all of 2001. A single organized campaign against Family Guy generated more than 4 times that in response to one episode. The scale of what the PTC's infrastructure could produce was genuinely remarkable. The FCC reviewed the complaints and took no action. They had declined to take action on every major Family Guy complaint that had come before, and they declined again. The legal standard for broadcast indecency requires that content be patently offensive as measured by contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium. In practice, this is a fairly high bar, and the FCC has consistently found that Family Guy's content, however crude, does not meet it. The agency's implicit position across many years of Family Guy complaints was essentially that a show that has been on the air for multiple years with wide viewership, clearly labeled with appropriate content warnings, and not targeting a particular vulnerable group, falls within the range of content that broadcast television has historically encompassed. Each FCC denial was its own kind of victory for the show, even as the complaint campaigns themselves generated publicity. Every headline about FCC complaints against Family Guy was also a reminder that Family Guy existed and was doing something that made institutional authority nervous. For the show's core audience, many of whom defined their taste partly in opposition to the kind of institutional conservatism the PTC represented, the complaints were confirmation that they were watching the right thing. The PTC's most persistent complaint was structural. They objected to Family Guy airing during hours when children were watching, in a format that looked like children's entertainment, with content that was clearly intended for adults. They lobbied Fox to move the show to later in the evening, after the traditional family viewing window. Fox never complied. The show continued to air during its usual Sunday evening time slot for most of its run, and the PTC continued to complain. One of the more unusual dimensions of the PTC versus Family Guy saga came in an episode called PTV from the 4th season. The episode was a direct satirical response to the entire censorship fight. In the story, David Hyde Pierce, the actor who played Frasier's brother Niles on NBC, accidentally exposes himself during a live awards show broadcast. The FCC, reacting to the incident, launches an aggressive campaign to censor anything in television that might possibly be construed as offensive. Their campaign quickly expands from addressing actual sexual content to censoring sneezes, because a sneeze sounds vaguely like something, and body movements, because bodies are potentially sexual, and eventually the FCC agents end up stationed inside the Griffin household, placing physical censor blocks on the family members themselves. The episode makes a specific argument about censorship. It says that the logic of the PTC and the FCC, taken to its conclusion, doesn't protect anyone from anything. It just produces a world where nothing can be depicted clearly, where every bodily reality has to be obscured, where communication becomes impossible. The argument is not subtle, but it landed with the show's audience in the way that effective satire of a real and ongoing conflict tends to land. The PTC considered filing a complaint about PTV specifically. The irony of filing a complaint about an episode that was explicitly about the absurdity of filing complaints was noted by media commentators at the time, and the organization ultimately decided against it. Their restraint in this case was probably wise. The spectacle of the PTC complaining about a show that was making fun of the PTC would have made them look exactly like what the show was suggesting they were. The 2015 episode, Our Idiot Brian, added a new chapter to the PTC Family Guy story when the show ended with a joke involving the word penis used in a double entendre context. The PTC called it out as another example of deliberate indecency. MacFarlane's response this time was completely different from anything he had done before. He offered PTC President Tim Winter a genuine opportunity. Write an episode of Family Guy yourself, MacFarlane said, or designate 2 writers of your choosing to do it. The offer was framed as a kind of challenge, a dare to engage with the show on its own creative terms rather than from the outside through regulatory pressure. What happened after that offer was genuinely surprising. Winter took the communication seriously. He and MacFarlane apparently had real conversations about the nature of the PTC's objections, conversations in which MacFarlane engaged with specific concerns rather than dismissing them wholesale. The public hostility between the two sides cooled noticeably after this exchange. The era of the major coordinated complaint campaigns against Family Guy seemed, for the most part, to be over by the mid-2010s. Whether that reflected genuine détente, exhaustion on both sides, or simply the show's declining cultural significance as a provocateur is hard to say from the outside. Possibly all three. Outside the PTC battle specifically, Family Guy attracted attention from other governmental and institutional quarters over the years. When the Season 7 episode 420 aired in 2009, it featured Brian Griffin leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's town. Venezuela's government responded by banning the show. The country's justice minister cited the episode as an example of American entertainment promoting drug use to foreign populations, and domestic cable stations were warned they would face fines for continuing to broadcast Family Guy. The show had generated an international government response to an episode about a cartoon dog advocating for cannabis. The AIDS-related controversy from the same period was different in character but equally real in its impact. The Season 5 episode, The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, featured a cutaway in which Peter and a barbershop quartet sang an upbeat song at the bedside of a man in the final stages of AIDS. The visual was Peter and 4 harmonizing strangers performing cheerfully in what was essentially a death room. Advocacy organizations representing people living with HIV and AIDS reacted immediately. Letters and statements described the scene as harmful and irresponsible, at a time when stigma around HIV remained a serious obstacle to treatment access and social support for affected communities. MacFarlane defended the scene as satire. The argument, as it usually was with Family Guy's most controversial moments, was that comedy about a terrible subject is not the same as endorsing or trivializing that subject, that dark humor can be a form of engagement with painful realities rather than an avoidance of them. Critics of the specific scene said there was a difference between engaging with a difficult subject through comedy and simply laughing at people who were suffering. The scene was not lampooning the policies around AIDS, or the stigma itself, or the inadequate response of institutions to the epidemic. It was just showing a man dying of AIDS and playing it for a joke about incongruity. The argument that there was meaningful content behind the shock was harder to sustain here than in some other cases. What all of these controversies, taken together, reveal about Family Guy's relationship to the culture around it is something about the specific provocation the show was built on. It did not push against limits out of a clearly articulated social agenda. It pushed because pushing was what it was built to do. The cutaway gag format was designed for surprise and unexpectedness, and the fastest way to surprise an audience was to go somewhere that conventions said you weren't supposed to go. Some of those journeys into forbidden territory had actual content worth defending. Others were just shock for its own sake, wearing the aesthetic costume of dark humor. The controversies that followed were often a mirror for which kind of provocation the show had produced. Section 4. The Banned Episode. Partial Terms of Endearment. There is one episode of Family Guy that has never aired on American television. Not during its original run, not in reruns, not in any syndication package, not on Adult Swim, not on FXX or Comedy Central or TBS or any of the other cable networks that have carried the show's back catalog for years. It is not available to stream on Hulu, which holds the United States streaming rights to the show's archive. The only way an American viewer can legally watch this episode is to purchase a specific DVD that was released in 2010 through domestic retail. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was produced as the final episode of the show's 8th season, written by Danny Smith, and delivered to Fox as a completed piece of television ready for broadcast. Fox looked at it and decided they could not air it, would not, in the sense of choosing not to do something they had the option to do. Could not, in the sense of having calculated that the commercial and political consequences of airing it were beyond what the network could absorb. The episode is about abortion. The way Family Guy deals with almost everything, it approaches this subject through a story rather than through direct argument. Lois Griffin runs into an old college friend named Naomi. Naomi and her husband are unable to conceive, and she asks Lois to serve as their surrogate. Lois agrees. She undergoes in vitro fertilization. She becomes pregnant. And then Naomi and her husband are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois pregnant with a fetus that has no living biological parents, no established surrogacy agreement, and no clear legal or emotional home. Lois now has to decide what to do. She can carry the pregnancy to term and arrange for adoption. She can terminate the pregnancy. She has to figure out what she actually believes, separate from what Peter believes, separate from what protesters outside her house believe, separate from what any institutional authority tells her she should believe. Peter, characteristically, gets pulled in several directions. He encounters anti-abortion activists who show him graphic imagery and work him into an ideological frenzy. He advocates forcefully against abortion. He then reconsiders. He then advocates forcefully again. His journey through the issue is played partly for comedy and partly as a genuine depiction of how people's positions on contested questions can be shaped by whoever they encountered most recently. The Peter who encounters the anti-abortion activists is not the same Peter who then talks with Lois, and neither of those Peters is necessarily being depicted as right. The episode ends with Lois making her decision. She has an abortion. The episode treats this decision with something approaching gravity. There is no joke at the climax. There is no punchline that recontextualizes the choice as absurd or ironic. Lois makes a decision about her own body, and the episode ends. Fox president Kevin Riley explained the decision not to air the episode in terms that were remarkably candid for a network executive talking publicly about censoring his own show's content. He said it was an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time. He said that of all the issues the show might address, this one presented the most risk of causing trouble. He said it was simply not worth it. There is something genuinely striking about the network that had broadcast a barbershop quartet singing cheerfully at an AIDS patient's deathbed, that had broadcast an episode containing what the PTC described as an 11-way orgy, that had broadcast every season of a show whose entire identity was built on going places television wasn't supposed to go, deciding that a story in which a female character makes an autonomous choice about her own pregnancy was too dangerous to air. The contrast is not subtle, but it is informative. The commercial logic of American broadcast television is not consistently coherent. It is shaped by the specific political and social pressures of specific moments, and the pressure around abortion in 2010 was sufficiently intense that Fox calculated the episode would create more damage than it was worth. Advertisers might pull out, activists might organize boycotts, politicians might use the episode as a rallying point. None of those consequences were impossible, and all of them were bad for the business. The episode did air internationally. BBC Three in the United Kingdom broadcast it in June of 2010. Other international markets followed at various points. The BBC's decision was framed internally as straightforward. The episode was a completed piece of television with legitimate satirical intent, and British broadcasting standards had no mechanism to refuse it on the basis of the episode's subject matter. MacFarlane's frustration with Fox's decision has been expressed multiple times over the years, each time in slightly different terms but with consistent underlying impatience. He described the episode as one of the show's better efforts, something that engaged seriously with a difficult subject rather than simply deploying the subject as a vehicle for shock. The refusal to air it was, in his view, a kind of cowardice, a network sacrificing a piece of genuine creative work to avoid commercial risk. The episode, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, from the 3rd season, offers a useful comparison. That episode, which told a story about Peter temporarily encouraging Chris to convert to Judaism after coming to believe that Jewish people had special financial acumen, was also held from broadcast by Fox for several years over concerns that it might be perceived as anti-Semitic. It eventually aired on Adult Swim during the hiatus years and was then broadcast by Fox in 2004. The delay was real, but the ban was not permanent. Partial Terms of Endearment has had no such second chapter. It remains as banned in the United States as it was on the day Fox decided not to air it. If anything, the political environment around abortion has become more rather than less charged in the years since the episode was completed, which makes the prospect of its ever receiving an American broadcast seem more remote rather than less. There is a strange quality to the episode's place in the show's legacy because of this. It is the most famous Family Guy episode that most Family Guy fans have never seen. It is the one episode where Fox drew a line that the show's many years of outrageous content had never managed to produce. And the line Fox drew was around a story in which a woman made a legal reproductive choice and was depicted doing so without guilt or irony. The banned content, in other words, was not graphic violence or sexual shock. It was female autonomy. That is the thing that got the episode pulled, and that fact says something about where the real lines of American broadcast television have always been. Section 5. Sarah Palin, Down Syndrome, and the episode that fought back. On Valentine's Day 2010, Family Guy aired an episode called Extra Large Medium. The title is a pun. A medium is a psychic. Peter Griffin discovers, or rather convinces himself he has discovered, that he has psychic abilities following an accidental head injury and begins performing as a clairvoyant for the people around him. This is the kind of premise that Family Guy built its middle seasons on. A broadly absurd situation for Peter, a separate subplot with another character, and cutaways peppered throughout to fill in the comic texture around the main story. The subplot involved Chris. He developed a romantic interest in a girl at his school named Ellen, who has Down syndrome. He asked her out. They went on a date. And during that date, in a single line of dialogue that lasted approximately 3 seconds of screen time, Ellen mentioned that her mother was the former governor of Alaska. 3 seconds. That is approximately how long it took to generate a political controversy that made national headlines for several days. Sarah Palin had been the governor of Alaska until July of 2009, when she resigned partway through her term. She was also the Republican vice presidential nominee in 2008, and she had a son named Trig who was diagnosed with Down syndrome shortly before his birth in April of 2008. The connection between Ellen's Down syndrome diagnosis and her mother's identity as the former governor of Alaska was unmistakable. The joke was a direct jab at Palin, suggesting a parallel between Ellen's situation and what it might be like to be Trig. Palin was vocal and forceful in her response. She went on television and posted on social media, describing the episode as cruel toward people with Down syndrome and toward her son specifically. She argued that Hollywood's willingness to use her child's disability as material for mockery reflected a contemptuous attitude toward disabled people, particularly when the target was a politically conservative figure. Her daughter, Bristol Palin, also responded, saying the episode was hurtful to her brother and to families dealing with Down syndrome more broadly. MacFarlane went on Larry King Live within days to address the controversy directly. His response was careful, in a way that his responses to PTC attacks often were not. He acknowledged the sensitivity of the subject. He did not dismiss Palin's concerns entirely. He defended the episode's intentions without going on the offensive against Palin personally. It was the kind of interview that neither fully satisfied his defenders, nor gave his critics a clean target to aim at. What shifted the entire shape of the controversy was something that nobody anticipated. The voice actress who played Ellen, the character at the center of the storm, released a public statement. Her name was Andrea Faye Friedman. She had a career in television, including a significant role in the series Life Goes On. She had worked before. She was a professional actress. She also had Down syndrome. Friedman's statement was direct and pointed. She introduced herself. She said she was born with Down syndrome. She said she had played the role of Ellen. She said she thought the line about being the daughter of the former governor of Alaska was funny. She said the word she would use for it was sarcasm. She described growing up in a family that believed laughter was good and that living a normal life was the goal. And then she added something that became one of the most widely circulated sentences from the entire controversy. saying that her mother had not carried her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread, the way Sarah Palin carried her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes. The statement landed with enormous force. Here was the person who had given voice to the character that Palin claimed was harmful to people with Down syndrome, who herself had Down syndrome, saying directly and without ambiguity that she was not harmed by the episode, that she found it funny, and that Palin's response was more about political exploitation than genuine concern for her community. Palin had positioned herself as an advocate for people with Down syndrome who had been hurt by the episode. Friedman, a person with Down syndrome, was saying that the advocate's framing was wrong and that the advocacy was being used in service of a different agenda. The structural reversal was complete and somewhat devastating. Bill Maher added his voice to the discussion in support of MacFarlane and the show, which was predictable given his politics, but contributed to the overall impression that the episode had more defenders than Palin's initial response might have suggested. The episode itself merits attention separate from the controversy it generated. Ellen is not depicted as helpless or as a symbol of suffering. She has her own personality, her own sense of humor, her own capacity to be mean in the way that teenagers sometimes are. The casting of Friedman was not incidental. It was a deliberate choice that gave the episode something it couldn't have had with a different actress. Friedman understood Ellen from the inside. She wasn't performing disability from the outside looking in. She was giving the character a specificity and an authenticity that showed the writers had thought about what they were doing. The Palin controversy reveals something specific about how Family Guy's political humor worked during its middle seasons. The show operated from a clearly left-liberal sensibility. MacFarlane's own politics were never secret, and they inflected the show's targets and the way those targets were handled. Palin was a particularly rich object of political satire during this period because of the specific contradictions in her public profile. The show aimed at those contradictions with the Down syndrome joke, and it aimed well, because the joke was not just a random potshot. It was constructed around something real and specific in a way that gave it substance beyond mere meanness. Whether the joke was appropriate is a question that doesn't resolve itself cleanly. Friedman's statement provided one answer, from someone who had standing to provide it. Palin's response provided another, from someone who had different but also real standing. What the controversy demonstrated ultimately is that satire aimed at powerful public figures has different stakes depending on who else gets included in the shot. And the question of who gets to speak for a community when a public figure claims to be speaking on its behalf is never simple. Section 6. Manatees and Warfare. The South Park Feud. In April of 2006, South Park aired the first part of a 2-episode arc called Cartoon Wars. The episodes were ostensibly about the controversy surrounding a planned Family Guy episode that would depict the Prophet Muhammad, which mirrored a real conflict South Park's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, had been having with Comedy Central about their own ability to depict Muhammad in their show. The politics of the Muhammad question were real and serious, and Parker and Stone were genuinely engaged with them. But the Muhammad storyline turned out to be the frame around the episode's real target. Cartoon Wars was not primarily about religious sensitivity or free speech. It was about Family Guy. It was Trey Parker and Matt Stone announcing to anyone who would listen exactly what they thought of Family Guy's approach to comedy. And they thought about it with a precision and a contempt that made the episode one of the most talked about pieces of animated television of its year. In Cartoon Wars Part 2, the character Eric Cartman infiltrates the Family Guy production facility on a mission to get the Muhammad episode pulled from the air. Inside the facility, Cartman makes a discovery that forms the episode's central image. Family Guy does not have human writers. The show is created by manatees. A group of trained sea mammals lives in a tank in the center of the production building. Around them in the water float dozens of beach balls, each one printed with a random word or phrase. The manatees select balls at random, push them through a machine, and the machine combines the words into Family Guy cutaway gags. No human judgment is involved. No craft, no intention. Just random ball selection by aquatic mammals. Cartman demonstrates the mechanism by removing one of the balls from the tank. The manatees stop working. They can only function when the full complement of balls is present. When he returns the ball, they resume, and the next gag they produce involves someone having a catheter at a job interview. The episode does not explain why this is funny. It doesn't need to. The joke is that Family Guy is not a comedy in any meaningful sense. It is a process for combining random elements and calling the result humor. The reaction to Cartoon Wars in the broader television animation community was, if anything, more striking than the episode itself. McFarlane later revealed that after the episodes aired, Parker and Stone had received phone calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill, two other animated Fox shows that existed in uncomfortable relationship with Family Guy, thanking them for making the episodes. Two other writing rooms, full of people who made their living doing what Family Guy was being accused of not doing, were applauding the attack. The industry's private opinion about Family Guy's writing quality had been at least partially exposed. Parker has said in multiple interviews that he hates Family Guy. Not dislikes, not finds problematic. Hates. He has articulated this position in press interviews on multiple occasions across many years, with a consistency that makes it clear this is not a performance for the benefit of a rivalry narrative, but something he genuinely believes. "I just want to say for the record right now, we've seen Family Guy and we do hate it," he said in one widely cited statement. Matt Stone has been slightly more measured but has made clear he shares the general assessment. McFarlane's public response to Cartoon Wars was more nuanced than many people expected. He said he found the episodes funny. He said he thought the criticism of the cutaway gag structure was accurate. He acknowledged the manatee critique had real merit. What he didn't understand, he said, was the personal venom that Parker and Stone expressed about him in press appearances outside the context of their work. The episodes themselves felt like creative engagement. The interview quotes felt like something else. In a 2012 Rolling Stone interview, McFarlane described the personal hostility as baffling, noting that he didn't know Parker or Stone personally and couldn't account for where it came from. Family Guy responded to Cartoon Wars, not with a direct attack but with a quieter shot in a 2009 episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, which featured Peter doing Family Guy-style humor at an improv comedy show while Quagmire performed South Park-style humor. Peter's material, the random non-sequiturs and cutaway-adjacent jokes, got big laughs. Quagmire's more satirical, character-driven approach got polite but noticeably less enthusiastic responses. The episode was essentially an argument that what Parker and Stone dismissed as lazy randomness was actually a form that audiences loved and responded to. Whether you find that argument convincing probably depends on which show you preferred. The underlying creative dispute between South Park and Family Guy represents one of the genuinely interesting debates in the history of American television comedy. South Park's position is essentially Aristotelian. Comedy is the product of character and situation. Jokes have to emerge from specific people in specific circumstances. A joke that could be placed anywhere in any episode without changing anything is not really a joke at all. It is the appearance of a joke, the shape of a joke, without the substance. The fact that the shape generates a laugh from an audience does not mean the laugh is earned. Family Guy's implicit counterargument is that comedy is permitted to be formally abstract. The cutaway gag is a form in its own right, one that gets its energy from surprise and incongruity and the gap between what's being discussed in the main scene and what the cutaway shows. The unexpectedness is not incidental to the joke. The unexpectedness is the mechanism. And unexpectedness cannot be systematically produced by the same method that produces character-driven comedy. It requires a different approach. Both of these things can be true at the same time, and the most honest reading of Family Guy's history suggests that the show understood this too. The early seasons used cutaways in a way that had real craft in it. The later seasons increasingly produced exactly the kind of random, interchangeable, manatee-adjacent gags that Parker and Stone were lampooning. The critique was fair when it was made. It became more rather than less accurate as the show continued. McFarlane gave a commencement speech at Harvard in 2006, while the South Park dispute was fresh, and addressed the Cartoon Wars episodes directly in character as Stewie. He acknowledged, in the persona of a character rather than as himself, that the cutaway gags existed for entertainment value and not to advance the plot. The concession was wrapped in comedy, but it was real. It was a moment of genuine self-awareness from a creator who knew exactly what his show was and chose to defend it on those terms rather than on terms that were more prestigious but less honest. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons was different in character but also existed as an ongoing undercurrent through much of the show's history. The Simpsons had been doing the animated family sitcom for 10 years before Family Guy premiered. Its creative influence on Family Guy was obvious and acknowledged by McFarlane himself. The lead characters were similar in basic profile. The fictional town setting was similar. The use of animation to explore material that live-action television wouldn't touch was something both shows shared. The resentment within The Simpsons creative community about Family Guy was generally expressed more quietly than South Park's open hostility, but it was real. Simpsons writers and producers felt, with some justification, that Family Guy had used their template without fully crediting the debt. The decision by the Simpsons team to celebrate when South Park mocked Family Guy tells you something about how the relationship was felt from the inside. When the two shows eventually did a crossover episode in 2014, the premise was built around a joke about Family Guy being a Simpsons knockoff. The fictional beer from Peter's World, Pawtucket Patriot Ale, was discovered to be a copy of Springfield's Duff Beer, and the whole story of the crossover revolved around this plagiarism dispute. It was either extraordinarily self-aware or a way of acknowledging the criticism while diffusing it through comedy, depending on how generously you read it. Separately, Family Guy also had a notable legal battle with The Simpsons' adjacent cultural world in 2006 through the feud about creative originality that played out through the South Park episodes. Writers at The Simpsons, according to coverage at the time, were privately appreciative of the South Park attack in a way that spoke to years of accumulated frustration about Family Guy's position in the animated landscape, and what many saw as its failure to honestly acknowledge the debt it owed to the earlier show. To understand why the South Park versus Family Guy feud mattered as much as it did in the mid-2000s, you have to understand what the landscape of adult animation looked like at that moment. There were exactly two shows that defined what adult animated comedy could be on American network and cable television. The Simpsons had been the titan for 15 years, the gold standard against which everything else was measured. But The Simpsons by 2005 was in its 18th season and widely agreed to be past its creative peak. The two shows actively competing for the position of most culturally significant animated adult comedy were Family Guy on Fox and South Park on Comedy Central. They were genuinely different shows with genuinely different comedy philosophies. And the difference was not merely aesthetic. It was philosophical in a way that mattered to people who cared about what comedy was for. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had built South Park on a very specific premise. The show would deal with real events and real controversies in something close to real time, and it would deal with them by working through the logical implications of the controversy with something resembling rigor. When South Park did an episode about a controversial subject, the episode was typically structured around a genuine argument. Characters would take positions, explore them, find them wanting, revise them, and arrive somewhere by the end of the episode that felt, if not definitively right, at least honestly interrogated. The show was frequently offensive in ways that made audiences uncomfortable, but the offense was usually in the service of something the show was trying to say. Family Guy's approach was categorically different. The cutaway gag format, which was the show's most distinctive structural element, did not lend itself to sustained argumentation. A cutaway is a detour. It interrupts whatever is happening in the main story and offers something unrelated before returning. It can be brilliant. It can be hilarious. It can catch an audience completely off guard. What it cannot easily do is develop a coherent argument over time, because by definition, it breaks the continuity of thought that argument requires. Parker and Stone noticed this. They found it unsatisfying. And in March 2006, in a two-part South Park episode called Cartoon Wars, they said so publicly in the most South Park way possible. The premise of Cartoon Wars involves Cartman launching a campaign to get Family Guy canceled from television, ostensibly because an upcoming Family Guy episode is going to depict the Prophet Muhammad, which Cartman argues will provoke violent retaliation against all Americans, and particularly against Cartman, who is afraid. Kyle counter-argues that censoring Family Guy sets a precedent for censoring any speech that someone finds offensive. The debate about whether to cancel Family Guy is the vehicle for a larger argument about free speech, censorship, and the specific question of whether Comedy Central, which airs South Park, would allow South Park to show Muhammad even as other networks were covering their own shows with restrictions. But embedded in the episode, and in the end more enduring in cultural memory than the Muhammad thread, was the joke about how Family Guy was written. A title card appears explaining that Family Guy's cutaway jokes are created by a team of manatees who live in a tank and push plastic balls around. Each ball is labeled with a random word or concept. A sentence of comedy is generated when a manatee pushes a specific combination of balls together. The implication was surgical. Family Guy's humor was not constructed by intelligence or intention. It was random. It could have been produced by a mechanism. The jokes didn't connect to each other or to any larger purpose. They were simply the output of arbitrary association. Parker spoke publicly about his genuine feelings regarding Family Guy in ways that went beyond the satirical framing of the episode. He said in interviews that he and Stone genuinely did not like the show, that they found its approach to comedy irresponsible, that the random association format provided no scaffolding for actual thought or genuine satire. He said that a joke that was simply there to be a joke, with no connection to anything beyond its own cleverness, could not be defended against the charge that it was harmful because there was no larger purpose to invoke as a defense. MacFarlane did not take the bait in the way Parker and Stone might have anticipated. He said in response to Cartoon Wars that South Park's criticism was pointed but not entirely accurate, that the cutaway format was more deliberate than the manatee metaphor suggested, and that the shows were simply doing different things. He was not wounded in any visible way. He showed up in interviews and said, essentially, that he respected what South Park did and didn't expect them to respect what Family Guy did, and that the television landscape had room for both approaches. He also noted, with some justice, that Parker and Stone's broader creative philosophy had its own complications. South Park's argumentation was often sophisticated, but the show's equal opportunity offense could shade into nihilism, into a kind of both sides framing that treated all positions as equally worthy of mockery, regardless of their substantive merits. The show that was criticizing Family Guy for being too random was sometimes guilty of a different kind of shallowness, the kind that says everything is equally absurd and no position is worth taking seriously. MacFarlane didn't make this argument at great length, but it was available to him. The feud also had a subtext that was rarely stated directly but was not difficult to read. Comedy Central and Fox were competing networks. Their animated offerings were competing for the same audience. The cultural prestige of being considered the smarter, more serious, more artistically legitimate show was worth something commercially because it translated into critical coverage, award nominations, and the kind of reputation that attracted writers and performers. Parker and Stone's attack on Family Guy was partly aesthetic and partly market positioning. Both things were true simultaneously. After Cartoon Wars, Parker reportedly received calls from writers on The Simpsons and King of the Hill, thanking him for the episodes. This was an interesting data point. The writers on other Fox animation block shows had been watching Family Guy eat up cultural oxygen for years, and some of them had opinions about the quality of what they were watching. The manatee critique found its way into the broader conversation about Family Guy in a way that suggests it resonated with people working in the industry, not just with critics and audiences. What the feud ultimately produced was a lasting critical vocabulary for Family Guy's limitations. After Cartoon Wars, the phrase manatee humor became available as a shorthand for the kind of comedy that generates laughs through random association rather than through construction. The phrase is not quite fair as a complete description of what Family Guy did, since the show's best cutaways were genuinely clever rather than merely random. But as a description of the show's worst habits, the habits that became more pronounced as the seasons accumulated and the writing room turned over and the show settled into its patterns, it was accurate enough to stick. Parker and Stone never softened their position. Decades later, in interviews, they remained consistent in their view that Family Guy represented an approach to comedy that they found fundamentally unsatisfying. MacFarlane, equally consistently, maintained that the shows were doing different things and that both were legitimate. The feud reached something like a stable détente without being resolved, which is perhaps the most adult outcome available to a dispute between two teams of adults who disagreed about aesthetics. Family Guy continued making cutaway gags. South Park continued making arguments. The audience for both shows remained substantial. The television industry made room for both approaches because it turned out that the viewing public was large enough and various enough to support both a show built on argumentation and a show built on disruption. The manatees remain, though. They swim in their tank, they push their balls around, and whenever someone wants to capture something specific and not entirely unfair about what Family Guy was doing in its later seasons, the image is right there, waiting. Section 7: Brian dies. The death and resurrection that broke the internet. On Sunday, the 24th of November, 2013, something happened on American television that generated more immediate and visceral public reaction than almost any scripted narrative moment in the history of animated comedy. Family Guy killed a character. Not a supporting character, not a villain, not someone the audience had met 3 episodes ago. Brian Griffin, who had been a central figure in the show since the very first episode 14 years earlier, who had been voiced by Seth MacFarlane himself throughout that entire run, who was the closest thing the show had to a moral and intellectual center, was hit by a car and died. The episode was called Life of Brian. It began without any particular indication that it was about to do something unprecedented. Brian and Stewie went on a time travel adventure that ended with Stewie having to destroy his time machine to prevent an ongoing paradox. They came home. The family was playing street hockey outside in their cul-de-sac. A car came around the corner. The show shifted tones with unusual speed. Brian's injuries were severe. The family took him to the emergency vet. The vet's assessment was clear. Brian was going to die. The family gathered around him. He died on the table, in a scene that the show treated with a gravity that its regular episodes almost never employed. There were no jokes. The grief on display was real within the world of the show, and it was presented without irony. Stewie, who had shared more genuine emotional moments with Brian over the seasons than any other character, was devastated in a way that felt authentic to who the character had become. Peter and the family mourned. They adopted a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, best known for his role in The Sopranos, to help fill the space that Brian had occupied. Vinny was added to the opening credits the following week, a signal that this was supposed to be a genuine change in the show's roster. The internet did not take this well. The hashtag RIP Brian trended at the top of Twitter within hours of the episode airing. A Change.org petition demanding that the show reverse Brian's death was created and gathered over 100,000 signatures in days. The story was covered as news, not as a television review item, by CNN, by major national newspapers, by entertainment outlets worldwide. Brian Griffin's death was a trending topic for multiple days. The emotional tenor of the response was grief, anger, and a specific kind of betrayal that comes from caring about something and having it taken away without warning. MacFarlane responded on social media in ways that seemed designed to manage the situation without fully clarifying it. He expressed appreciation for people's care about the character. He said the reaction had genuinely surprised the creative team. He didn't say Brian was coming back. He didn't say he wasn't. 2 episodes later, on December 15th, the episode Christmas Guy aired. Stewie, using a fragment of a time travel device obtained from a separate source, went back to the moment just before the car hit Brian. He stepped in. He prevented the accident. Brian did not die. He came home for Christmas. Vinny, who had been on the show for approximately 3 weeks, was quietly written back out. The entire experience of Brian's death, the grief, the adjustment, the gradual acceptance of Vinny as a new presence, was undone as completely as if it had never happened. MacFarlane's tweet after the resurrection became its own media moment. The paraphrase that circulated widely quoted him as saying something to the effect of, "Did you really think we'd kill off Brian Griffin? That they would have to be genuinely out of their minds to do that." The framing repositioned the whole thing as an extended joke, a bit that the show had pulled on its audience for comic and dramatic effect. Some viewers found this reading funny in retrospect. Others found it infuriating. The manufactured emotion of Brian's death, the real grief that many viewers had felt in the episode and the days afterward, was being described after the fact as the punchline to a gag. The industry discussion that followed the resurrection was significant. Producers and critics pointed out that what the show had done was manufacture a major emotional event, reap the ratings and attention that came from it, and then undo it almost immediately to avoid the actual consequences of that event. Brian's death had generated 100,000 signatures on a petition, days of trending topics, national news coverage, and presumably a meaningful ratings bump in the resurrection episode. The show had gotten all of that at the cost of a 3-week disruption to its status quo. The phrase "ratings stunt" appeared in essentially every major analysis of the event. The show had deployed the emotional weight of a permanent character death without being willing to accept the permanence. It had borrowed emotional investment from its audience and returned it devalued Because an emotional experience that was real while it was happening becomes something different when you're told it was manufactured for commercial purposes. Seth MacFarlane's stated reaction to the fan response was that he was genuinely surprised by the size of it. He described it as positive evidence, proof that the audience still cared deeply about the character after 14 years. Given the massive viewership Family Guy had maintained over many years, the consistency of Brian's presence throughout that run, and the genuine quality of the character in his early seasons, this claim of surprise was received skeptically by many observers. The Brian death episode also became a reference point in broader discussions about what Family Guy had been doing to its characters across its middle and later seasons. The argument was made that the show's inability to commit to Brian's death was a concentrated example of a pattern that had been operating for years. Good episodes would end with Peter learning something, with a character having a genuine emotional realization, with a relationship dynamic shifting in a meaningful way. And then the next episode would reset. Nothing would carry. No consequence would persist. The story was always going back to where it started. Brian's death was that pattern writ large, compressed into 3 weeks of national attention. The audience had been shown that consequences were real. They had mourned, they had petitioned, and then they had been told it was a trick. Vinny, the replacement dog voiced by Tony Sirico, has a complicated legacy in the fan discussion of this period. He was, by most accounts, an interesting and entertaining presence in the episodes he appeared in. Sirico's specific voice and cadence brought something distinct to the character that was different from anything else in the Griffin household. The people who argue that the show made a genuine mistake in reversing Brian's death as quickly as it did often point to Vinny as evidence. There was creative potential there that the show abandoned within weeks because the audience reaction to its loss was too strong to absorb. What the whole episode revealed, more than anything else, was something about the relationship between Family Guy and its audience that had developed over 14 years. The show could be cruel, it could be lazy, it could repeat itself endlessly, and resist letting its characters grow. But the audience still cared about Brian Griffin. 100,000 petition signatures for a cartoon dog says something real about the depth of the connection that the show had built during its best years, and about how much of that connection had survived even the long decline. In the fall of 2013, the writers of Family Guy made a decision that they would later describe as an experiment in testing their audience's attachment to the show's characters. The decision was to kill Brian Griffin, one of the show's 2 most beloved characters, in a way that looked and felt permanent. The planning was apparently extensive. MacFarlane and the showrunners discussed the decision for some time before committing to it. They wanted to see whether the audience had genuinely internalized these characters after 14 years, whether the emotional stakes of the show were real in some meaningful sense, whether the artificial world they had built in a small Rhode Island city had acquired the kind of weight that made losses within it feel like actual losses. The episode that executed on this decision was called Life of Brian, and it aired on the 24th of November, 2013. In the episode, Brian is hit by a car. The accident is depicted directly. He is rushed to a veterinary hospital. The family gathers. He dies. The scene at Brian's grave, in which the family mourns and in which Stewie gives a speech about what Brian meant to him, was written and performed with genuine emotional intent. It was not played as a joke. It was played as a loss. The family then acquired a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, who brought to the role the specific New York energy that would become immediately and unavoidably associated with his performance as Paulie Walnuts in The Sopranos. Vinny was cheerful and uncomplicated and Italian-American and had no idea what he was walking into. The Griffin family was gentle with him, the way you are gentle with someone who has stepped into a situation that is really not about them at all. What happened in the hours after Life of Brian aired was something that the social media infrastructure of 2013 was perfectly designed to amplify. The hashtag RIP Brian appeared on Twitter within minutes of the episode ending and trended nationally within an hour. The Change.org petition calling for Brian's return was live by the following morning and accumulated signatures with a speed that the platform had rarely seen for a non-political cause. By the time Fox and the Family Guy team were reading their morning news coverage, the petition had over 100,000 signatures. News organizations sent reporters to cover the story. The Associated Press ran a piece. The New York Times covered the fan reaction. Cable news networks discussed it. This is if you pause to consider it, genuinely extraordinary. A fictional dog had died on an animated sitcom, and the mainstream news media covered the audience response as a news event. The coverage was not condescending. It was curious, as if the reporters writing it recognized that something interesting was happening in the relationship between a television show and its audience that was worth documenting. The reaction had layers. There was genuine grief from people who had watched the show since childhood, and for whom Brian was a constant, a familiar figure who had been in their lives for the entire span of their teen years and into their young adulthood. There was anger, which was different from grief, and came from a different place. The anger was at being manipulated, at having an emotional investment exploited rather than honored. If Brian was truly dead, then every episode in which he had been built up as a character was now retroactively set up for a stunt. And then there was the more complicated response of people who felt that the anger and the grief were themselves the point, that the episode had successfully demonstrated exactly the thing it set out to demonstrate. The show brought Brian back 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy. Stewie used his time machine to go back to the moment of the accident and prevent it. Brian was alive. Vinny was sent back to wherever he came from, gently and without incident. The family's world was restored to its familiar configuration. The response to the resurrection was also immediate and also loud, though its emotional tenor was entirely different from the response to the death. There was relief, and there was joy, and there was also a significant contingent of people who were furious. These were the people who felt that the resurrection confirmed their worst suspicion about the death, that it had been a rating stunt. The show had killed a beloved character for the purpose of generating exactly the reaction it generated, and then undone the death because keeping it would have been commercially and creatively impractical. That suspicion was not unfounded. MacFarlane and the showrunners gave interviews after the resurrection in which they explained the decision-making process. They said they had always planned to bring Brian back. They said the experiment had been designed to test emotional attachment, not to make a permanent narrative choice. They said they had been genuinely surprised by the scale of the reaction, though they acknowledged they had hoped for significant response. The always plan to bring him back part of the explanation was what most infuriated the critics of the stunt. It confirmed that the grief was purchased under false pretenses. The audience had been allowed to believe something was permanent when the people producing the show knew it wasn't. This is a thing that shows can do with consequences, and some of the commentary at the time drew connections between this specific choice and the show's broader pattern of engaging emotional stakes without following through on them, of gesturing toward narrative weight and then retreating to safety. The defense of the stunt, advanced by MacFarlane and others, was also coherent. The audience's response had proven something important. After 14 years, the emotional investment in these characters was deep and real. The 100,000 petition signatures and the trending hashtag and the national news coverage were evidence that Family Guy had built something genuinely meaningful in its viewers' inner lives. The death was the instrument that made the measurement possible. The resurrection restored what had been temporarily removed. Whether the measurement was worth the cost of the manipulation is a judgment call. What is not a judgment call is what the episode revealed about the specific character of the attachment. The attachment was, in a word, to Brian. Not to Peter, not to Stewie, not to any of the other characters who populated the show's world. The 100,000 signatures were for Brian specifically. The trending topic was his name. The national news coverage was about a talking dog who drank martinis and wrote bad novels, and was, in the view of the people signing that petition, irreplaceable. That specificity is worth sitting with. Brian Griffin had become something particular to Family Guy's audience. He was the character who felt most like a real person rather than a cartoon type. His flaws were recognizable human flaws. His aspirations were recognizable human aspirations. His failures were the failures of someone who wanted more than his circumstances allowed and didn't always handle the gap between wanting and having with grace. Viewers saw themselves in him, or saw people they knew in him, in a way that was different from how they experienced Peter's buffoonery or Stewie's absurdist villainy. When he came back, it wasn't just relief about the show being restored to its familiar shape. It was something more personal than that. Section 8. The Legal Battles. Carol Burnett, Born Music, and the First Amendment. Family Guy's history of controversy was not limited to regulatory battles with the FCC and cultural arguments with the PTC. The show also generated a series of formal legal challenges that forced American courts to engage with questions about the nature and limits of parody as a protected form of expression. These cases moved the argument about what Family Guy could say from the realm of public opinion into the realm of law, where the questions were more precisely defined and the answers had actual consequences. The most prominent of the legal challenges came in March of 2007, when comedian Carol Burnett filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox and the producers of Family Guy. The lawsuit sought $6 million in damages and was based on an episode from the show's fourth season, which had aired in 2006. In the episode, a cutaway gag depicted Burnett's famous charwoman character, the cleaning woman she had created for The Carol Burnett Show decades earlier, mopping the floor of what appeared to be an adult entertainment shop. The scene used what the lawsuit described as an altered version of Burnett's distinctive theme music, and characters in the scene performed her famous ear-pull gesture, which had been her signature way of saying good night to her mother at the end of each broadcast. Burnett's complaint alleged copyright infringement, trademark infringement, and violation of her right of publicity. The right of publicity is a legal concept that protects individuals from having their identity, likeness, or persona used for commercial purposes without their consent. Her position was that Family Guy had taken a character she had created and invested decades of creative work into, placed her in a pornographic context, and done so without seeking her permission. Family Guy's response was swift and pointed. The show issued a statement noting that Family Guy, like The Carol Burnett Show itself, was famous for its parodies of celebrities and public figures, and expressing surprise that Burnett, who had made a career of lampooning others on television, would take legal action against a simple comedic bit. The implicit argument in the response, which would become the legal argument before the court, was that parody is protected speech under the First Amendment and that a parody of a publicly known character does not require the permission of the character's creator. United States District Judge Dean D. Pregerson dismissed Burnett's lawsuit in June of 2007. His ruling cited Hustler magazine v. Falwell as controlling precedent, a case from 1,988 inches, which the Supreme Court had established that parody of public figures, even when offensive, is protected under the First Amendment unless it makes false statements of fact. The judge found that Family Guy's use of the charwoman character was clearly parody, that no reasonable viewer would take it as a literal statement about Carol Burnett, and that the protection afforded to parody under the First Amendment prevented the claim from proceeding. The judge did acknowledge something in his ruling that has been cited in subsequent discussions of the case. He noted that the original charwoman character was far more creative than anything Family Guy had produced with it. The dismissal of the case did not constitute a judicial endorsement of the quality of the parody. It constituted a ruling that the parody's quality was legally irrelevant to the question of whether it was protected. The second major legal challenge came in October of 2007, just 4 months after the Burnett case was dismissed. This one came from a music publisher called Born Co. Music publishers, which held the rights to the song When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic Pinocchio theme. Born alleged that Family Guy had infringed its copyright on the song through a parody version called I Need a Jew that appeared in the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The episode had a complicated history of its own. It was produced during the original run but held from broadcast by Fox for several years over concerns that its premise, which revolved around Peter temporarily encouraging his son to convert to Judaism based on a belief that Jewish people had special financial acumen, might be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim during the hiatus years and was then broadcast by Fox in 2004. I Need a Jew was a musical sequence in which Peter sang to the stars, in explicit imitation of the structure and melody of When You Wish Upon a Star, about wanting a Jewish person to help him manage his finances. Born's argument was that the song wasn't truly a parody, which would have been protected, but rather an unauthorized derivative work that borrowed the melody and structure of the original without transforming it sufficiently to qualify for parody protection. United States District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy in March of 2009, holding that the song was a legitimate parody protected under the fair use doctrine. The ruling found that the song was commenting on the original, specifically using the familiar and beloved quality of the original melody to frame a joke about the contrast between innocent childhood wishes and crass adult concerns. A third lawsuit came in December of 2007 and involved an actor named Art Metrano, who had been known in the early years of his career for a signature comedy bit involving absurd faux magical hand gestures performed while humming a tune called Fine and Dandy. Metrano alleged that a scene in the direct-to-DVD Family Guy film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, had depicted Jesus Christ performing his exact routine without his permission. This case was settled out of court under terms that were not publicly disclosed. Taken together, these legal battles form a picture of Family Guy as a show that consistently pushed against the edges of what parody protection was understood to cover. In each case where a court ruled on the merits, the show prevailed. The First Amendment, in the context of comedy and cultural commentary, is broadly protective of the kind of work Family Guy was doing. The lawsuits also illustrate the specific kind of cultural power that Family Guy had accumulated by the mid-2000s. Major public figures and significant rights-holding companies were willing to spend the time and money to file federal lawsuits over how the show depicted them or used their creative work. You don't sue things that don't matter. The relationship between comedy and the law is, in some respects, the relationship between what you want to say and what you are permitted to say, with the entire apparatus of the American legal system mediating the conversation. For most of its history, Family Guy has existed well within the protections that the First Amendment extends to creative expression. But it has not always been easy to stay there, and the cases where it came close to the line or crossed it are illuminating about where those lines actually fall. The most prominent legal challenge in the show's history came from Carol Burnett, one of the most respected and beloved figures in the history of American television comedy. Burnett's career is a landmark in American entertainment. The Carol Burnett Show, which ran on CBS from 1967 to 1978, was a model of what variety television could be at its best. It was smart and warm and technically accomplished, and it made Burnett one of the most recognizable faces on American television for over a decade. Among the many things that became associated with her publicly during those years was a specific character she played, the Charwoman, a cleaning woman who appeared in the show's opening and closing segments as a kind of unofficial symbol of the program. And among the things associated with Burnett personally was a gesture, an ear tug that she used at the end of each broadcast as a personal signal to her grandmother who watched from home. In the fourth season episode Pete Erotica, which aired in 2007, a background character appeared who was very clearly presented as a reference to the Charwoman. The character was mopping the floor of what was unambiguously a shop selling pornographic materials. The scene also used a brief audio clip of the theme from The Carol Burnett Show. The combination of the visual reference to Burnett's most iconic character and the sexually explicit context was deliberate. It was a joke. The joke was that the Charwoman worked at a porn store. Burnett filed suit. Her claims were under California's right of publicity statute, which protects living persons from having their name, image, likeness, or identity used for commercial purposes without their consent. She also pursued a copyright claim regarding the use of the show's theme music. The damages she sought were calculated at a level designed to send a message to Fox and McFarlane about the costs of using someone's creative identity without permission. The case worked its way through the courts over several years. The central legal question was whether Family Guy's depiction of the Charwoman constituted parody, and therefore fell within the First Amendment's protection for commentary and transformative use, or whether it was simply appropriation of someone else's creative identity for commercial gain with no meaningful satirical content. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately ruled in Fox's favor. The court found that the Family Guy depiction qualified as parody because it commented on the original character, however crudely, by placing her in an incongruous context. Parody, under American law, is protected even when it uses material from the work being parodied, precisely because commenting on something through imitation is a form of expression that First Amendment jurisprudence considers too valuable to prohibit. Burnett's lawyers argued that the scene was not genuine parody in any meaningful sense, that it was simply using a recognizable character from Burnett's career to generate a cheap joke about pornography, and that calling this commentary was a stretch of the parody doctrine beyond what its purpose justified. It was a reasonable argument. The legal definition of parody is genuinely broad, and courts have sometimes applied it in ways that stretch the ordinary meaning of the word. Whether the charwoman in a porn store scene was saying something about the charwoman, about Carol Burnett's career, or about the contrast between wholesome television and adult content was a question with more than one defensible answer. The ruling stood. Burnett's claims were dismissed. The case established, in the jurisdiction of the Ninth Circuit, that animated parody of a celebrity's public persona and creative identity was protected under the First Amendment even when the parody placed that persona in an explicitly sexual context. McFarlane has said in interviews that he found the litigation uncomfortable, not because he thought the legal outcome was wrong, but because Carol Burnett was someone he respected and he didn't enjoy being on the opposite side of a lawsuit from her. Whether this discomfort translated into changed practices and how the show depicted real people and their creative identities is not something the public record makes entirely clear. A separate legal challenge came from Born Music, a music publisher, which sued Fox in 2007 over the show's use of a song it controlled without what it characterized as proper licensing. The specific song, the specific episode, and the specifics of the claim were less publicly prominent than the Burnett case, partly because the question of music licensing and entertainment is both extremely common and extremely technical, not the kind of controversy that generates national news coverage. The case was settled out of court on terms that were not disclosed. The pattern that both cases illustrate is something about how Family Guy exists in the intellectual property landscape. The show's practice of referencing, sampling, and repurposing elements of popular culture, its tendency to invoke recognizable figures and properties and then do something unexpected or offensive with them, creates ongoing questions about the boundaries of permissible creative appropriation. American intellectual property law provides significant room for commentary, parody, and transformative use. But the room is not infinite, and the show has had to navigate its edges carefully. The music licensing question, though less glamorous than a lawsuit from a beloved television legend, is actually more operationally significant for the show's production. Every episode contains multiple musical references, brief clips, and original compositions that exist in dialogue with the commercial music landscape. The licensing apparatus required to produce each season is substantial, and the cost of getting it wrong, either through actual infringement or through litigation over disputed uses, is real. McFarlane has spoken in general terms about his belief in the importance of protecting creative work, which creates an obvious tension with a creative practice built significantly on borrowing and repurposing other people's creative work. He has not resolved this tension publicly in any particularly satisfying way, though it's worth noting that his position is not unusual. Many creative people simultaneously believe that their own work deserves strong protection and that the work of others provides legitimate raw material for commentary and transformation. What both legal battles ultimately contributed to was a clarified understanding of where Family Guy's legal exposure actually was. The show was broadly protected by the First Amendment for satirical and parodic use of public figures and their creative identities. It was exposed to music licensing claims in the ordinary way that any entertainment property using commercial music is exposed, and it had, through the Burnett case specifically, tested the limits of right of publicity claims against animated parody and found that those limits were further out than some had assumed. Section 9. The Creator versus the Network. Seth MacFarlane and his divorce from Fox. By the time Seth MacFarlane went public with his frustrations about Family Guy's continued association with Fox, the relationship between creator and network had been strained for years in ways that only occasionally broke the surface of public discussion. The strain was about politics, about creative control, about the structural reality of being contractually bound to an institution whose values had diverged significantly from your own. MacFarlane had always been outspoken about his politics. His views, broadly liberal and socially progressive, were never something he tried to hide. They were embedded in the show from the beginning. Brian Griffin's positions, his environmentalism, his atheism, his liberal social positions, were always a reflection of MacFarlane's own worldview. The show made fun of conservative politicians, conservative cultural figures, and conservative ideological positions with the kind of regularity that made its sensibility transparent to anyone paying attention. Fox Broadcasting and Fox News are legally distinct entities. Fox Broadcasting is owned by Fox Corporation. Fox News exists within the same corporate family tree but is a separate organizational and legal entity. This distinction matters in a precise legal sense, and matters very little in the way that most people experience the brands. When people think of Fox News, they don't naturally separate it from Fox Broadcasting in the way the corporate structure would suggest. They think of them as part of the same thing, a product of the same worldview, a project of the same ownership. McFarlane had been uncomfortable with this association for years before he said so publicly. The discomfort built gradually as Fox News moved further and further in a direction that conflicted with everything he personally believed and everything his shows were designed to express. It crystallized around Tucker Carlson, who by the late 2010s had become the most visible face of a Fox News brand that McFarlane found genuinely alarming. His first public expression of this discomfort came in 2018, when he tweeted that he was embarrassed to be associated with the same parent company that employed Tucker Carlson. The specific trigger was Carlson telling his audience to ignore other news sources and just trust Fox News. McFarlane's response described this as an instruction not to think critically, and said he was embarrassed to be producing content for the same corporation that was issuing that instruction. This was unusual, not unique in the history of American entertainment, but unusual. A major creator publicly expressing embarrassment about the network that had built him into what he was, over the news organization that shared that network's corporate family name, in a tweet that would be seen by millions of people. It was the kind of thing that normally stays inside contract negotiations and private conversations. In April of 2020, as Fox News was doing coverage of the early COVID-19 pandemic that McFarlane found irresponsible, he responded to a tweet from Fox News host Laura Ingraham with a statement saying he genuinely could not understand how he produced content for the same corporation. The language was stronger this time, not embarrassment, incomprehension. Then, in January of 2020, he had made a business move that gave his public frustrations a concrete material dimension. He signed a new deal with NBC Universal Content Studios, which was later described in reporting as being worth approximately $200 million over 5 years. The deal moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, from its longtime home at Fox's production division into the NBC Universal ecosystem. His future projects would be developed for NBC's platforms. The Orville, his science fiction series, moved to Hulu. His Ted prequel series was developed for the Peacock streaming service, which is NBC Universal's direct-to-consumer platform. McFarlane was building his creative future inside a company that competed directly with Fox. In August of 2021, following another round of Tucker Carlson commentary that McFarlane found offensive, he posted his most direct public statement about the situation. Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again makes me wish Family Guy was on any other network. Then he continued, "Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore. The sex is only once a year, I don't get along with your mother, and well, I've been having an affair with NBC." The marriage metaphor was apt in ways that went beyond what the joke required. Family Guy had been on Fox since 1999. That's not a professional relationship. That's a relationship longer than many actual marriages. And like the longest marriages, it had accumulated years of grievances, adjustments, and compromises until both parties had changed enough from who they were at the beginning that the original connection barely resembled what remained. McFarlane still showed up. He still provided his voice to the characters every season. He was still contractually and professionally tied to the show's continued production. But the emotional and creative investment that had made the show what it was in its early years had clearly redirected itself elsewhere. Fox could not simply let Family Guy go. The show was not theirs to lose. McFarlane's production deal had moved, but the show itself was owned by Fox's content division, now operating under the Disney umbrella after the sale of Fox's entertainment assets. Family Guy belonged to the corporate successor to the entity that had originally greenlit it, and that entity was not interested in releasing it from its contractual obligations to McFarlane's preferences. The result was a situation that anyone observing the show from the outside could feel, but that the public statements only occasionally made explicit. Family Guy continued to be produced, season after season, with its creator providing voices on a schedule and its network airing it in whatever slot served the network's interests. The creative passion that had built the show was elsewhere. The business machinery kept running. In April of 2025, Family Guy secured a major renewal deal with Disney that locked the show in through its 27th season and the 2028 to 2029 television season. That would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the deal would produce 15 episodes. The business logic, as it always was completely clear. The show was cheap relative to live action. Its catalog generated substantial ongoing revenue through streaming and international distribution. Its brand had value that would persist regardless of whether the first-run episodes were performing at the level of the show's peak years. MacFarlane's description of the show in a 2024 interview was revealing in the quiet way that things said without dramatic intent tend to be. He said he didn't see a good reason to stop making it, that people still found it entertaining, and that it generated revenue that supported environmental causes he cared about, specifically mentioning organizations like Rainforest Trust. That framing, the show as a mechanism for generating charitable giving, was a long way from the vision of a young animator pitching a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998 because he had something to say. Both things are probably true about the same show at different points in its history. But the distance between them is real, and the show's later seasons reflect that distance, whether anyone involved acknowledges it or not. The history of Family Guy is, among other things, a story about how a creator comes to resent the institution that made him successful. This is not an unusual story in American entertainment. Creative people frequently have complicated relationships with the studios, networks, and distribution platforms that provide the infrastructure for their work. The provision of that infrastructure comes with conditions, and the conditions are not always ones that creative people would choose for themselves. The negotiation over those conditions, which never fully resolves itself, is the ongoing subtext of most significant creative careers in the entertainment industry. Seth MacFarlane's version of this story has some specific features that make it worth examining carefully. The most visible dimension of his conflict with Fox has been his relationship to Fox News. MacFarlane is, by his own description, and by the consistent evidence of his creative work, a liberal. He believes in the scientific consensus on climate change and has been outspoken about that. He opposes what he describes as misinformation in political media. He has, over many years, made Fox News specifically a target of political jokes on Family Guy, which was producing those jokes for a network owned by the same parent company as the news channel being satirized. This is an unusual situation. The show that makes fun of Fox News airs on a channel that is a corporate sibling of Fox News. MacFarlane has used this arrangement with visible relish, creating at least the impression that he finds the absurdity of it as amusing as anything he puts on screen. Peter Griffin has made fun of Fox News commentators. The show has depicted the channel's editorial practices in unflattering terms. All of this aired on Fox Broadcasting, which is connected to Fox News through the corporate chain that leads up through 21st Century Fox and then to Rupert Murdoch. In 2019, the situation escalated from subtext to text. Tucker Carlson, who was then hosting one of Fox News' most-watched primetime programs, made statements about immigration that MacFarlane found not merely objectionable, but actively harmful. MacFarlane posted on social media that Carlson's rhetoric, along with the rhetoric of other Fox News hosts, was making the network a venue for promoting white nationalism. He said publicly that he found his continued association with the Fox brand uncomfortable and wished he were on a different network. This was not a joke. This was the creator of one of Fox's longest-running and most commercially valuable programs, publicly saying that he wished his show were on a competitor's network. The statement generated significant coverage precisely because of how unusual it was. Carlson responded on his program with characteristic dismissal, describing MacFarlane's concerns as the reflexive politics of a Hollywood liberal who didn't understand real America. The exchange attracted attention and then faded, as these things do, into the accumulating background noise of American cultural politics. But the underlying tension did not fade. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a deal with NBC Universal valued at approximately $200 million. The deal moved his production company's development relationship to the Comcast ecosystem, away from the Fox infrastructure that had been his creative home since 1998. His science fiction series The Orville, which had begun at Fox, was moved to Hulu, which is a streaming platform in which NBC Universal has a significant ownership stake. The Ted prequel series he developed went to Peacock, the NBC Universal streaming platform. The message was not subtle. MacFarlane was building his future elsewhere. Family Guy remained at Fox because the contractual and commercial arrangements made it impractical to move, and because Fox controlled significant elements of the show's intellectual property. But every other significant creative project MacFarlane was developing was being routed through a different corporate entity. There is a public statement MacFarlane made in 2021 that captures the emotional tenor of his relationship to Fox more precisely than anything else in the record. He described it as being like a marriage that both parties know isn't working anymore, but that neither party is quite ready to end formally. The obligations are real. The history is long. There are children, in the metaphorical sense, that tie them together, but the feeling of genuine partnership has eroded, and both parties are more or less aware of this. Family Guy is the child in that metaphor. The show is the reason the relationship persists past the point where both parties might prefer it to end. As long as the show continues to generate the revenue it generates, as long as the licensing deals and the streaming rights and the merchandise ecosystem remain commercially significant, the Fox-MacFarlane relationship will continue in, however attenuated and uncomfortable a form. MacFarlane was also involved in a conflict with Fox over the science communication series Cosmos, which he executive produced and brought to the network as a revival of Carl Sagan's landmark 1980 series. The show aired in 2014 with astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson as host, attracted significant critical attention, and was not renewed by Fox for a second season. MacFarlane's publicly expressed frustration with that decision was real and visible. He had believed in Cosmos as something more than a commercial proposition. He had seen it as a public service, as an expression of a commitment to science, literacy, and rational inquiry that he considered one of the most important uses to which his platform could be put. The network's calculation had been commercial, and the commercial calculation had not favored renewal. This is the dimension of the MacFarlane-Fox relationship that most clearly reveals the nature of the conflict. It is not simply a political disagreement about the merits of Fox News's editorial practices, though that disagreement is real. It is a more fundamental disagreement about what television is for. MacFarlane has a vision of what he wants to do with his resources and his audience that extends beyond ratings optimization and brand maintenance. He wants to make things that matter, things that say something about the world, things that contribute to the culture rather than simply extracting value from it. Fox's institutional interests are primarily commercial. The network's first obligation is to its shareholders, and the metric by which it evaluates everything is whether it generates returns. These two orientations were compatible during the period of maximum commercial success, when Family Guy was generating enough revenue to give MacFarlane significant leverage and to make the network receptive to his other projects. They became less compatible as the show's ratings declined, and MacFarlane's leverage reduced accordingly. The 2023 WGA strike added another chapter to the story. MacFarlane walked out with the writers, as he had in 2007 to 2008, and was visible on the picket lines. His public statements about the strike were the most forceful labor political statements he had ever made, connecting the studio's negotiating positions to a broader pattern of corporate behavior that he described as economically destructive to the people who actually made television. He was not speaking as a detached observer. He was speaking as someone who had watched, from a position of relative privilege within the industry, what the economics of streaming had done to the careers of working writers. The strike was settled in the fall of 2023. Family Guy's production resumed. The 2025 renewal deal that extended the show through its 30th year was announced. MacFarlane would continue to voice Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. The machine would continue to turn. Section 10. The Cleveland Recast and Representation in Animation. The summer of 2020 was a moment of genuine cultural rupture in American life, and one of the industries that found itself suddenly and urgently examined was American entertainment. The death of George Floyd in May produced a wave of public reflection about race and representation that reached into every corner of the creative industry. Casting decisions, character portrayals, production structures, and the demographic makeup of writers' rooms and executive suites were all examined with an intensity that had no real precedent in the industry's recent history. For animation specifically, one question emerged with particular clarity. Animated characters are built around voices. The voice actor is not just technically essential to the character. The voice is a core part of what the character is, how the character feels, how the audience relates to the character over years and decades of viewing. And American animation had a long and largely unexamined history of white voice actors providing the voices for characters of color. Family Guy had a prominent example of this practice in the figure of Cleveland Brown. Cleveland had been one of Peter Griffin's core group of friends from the very beginning of the show. He was black, soft-spoken, patient, and likable in a way that complemented the louder personalities around him. He had appeared in almost every season and had been given enough character development to lead his own 4-season spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. He was not a minor supporting character. He was one of the show's central figures. Cleveland had been voiced since the show's premiere by Mike Henry. Henry was white and had been providing the voice of a black character for over 20 years. He had developed the voice over the course of that long run in a specific and recognizable way. The Cleveland Brown voice was known. It was part of the show's sound. On the 26th of June, 2020, Henry posted a statement on social media. He said he loved the character. He said he was grateful for the years he had spent developing and voicing Cleveland. He said he was stepping down from the role, and the reason he gave was direct and unambiguous. Persons of color should play characters of color, he wrote. He would continue voicing other characters on the show and writing for it, but Cleveland was not his to voice anymore. The statement arrived as part of a wave. Jenny Slate stepped away from voicing a mixed-race character on the Netflix show Big Mouth within days. Kristen Bell stepped away from voicing a biracial character on the HBO Max show Central Park. The Simpsons announced a general policy that white actors would no longer voice non-white characters. The industry was moving, quickly and with unusual coordination, to address a practice that had been normal for decades. The practical question of who would voice Cleveland after Henry's departure was answered in an unexpected way. The production team found the answer on YouTube. Arif Zahir, who performed under the name Azarez online, had built a substantial following by performing impressions of cartoon characters, and among those impressions was Cleveland Brown. He had done Cleveland impressions because he loved the character, out of pure fan enthusiasm for a show he had grown up watching. When Henry stepped down, Zahir heard about it and, by his own account, was devastated at the thought that the character might simply disappear rather than be recast. The Family Guy team found him through his YouTube channel and offered him the role. His reaction, publicly stated, was one of overwhelming gratitude. He expressed his respect for what Henry had built with the character and his commitment to honoring that legacy while also bringing his own voice to the role. Henry, for his part, welcomed Zahir warmly and expressed confidence in his abilities. Zahir began voicing Cleveland in season 19, which entered production after his casting was announced in September of 2020. The season 18 episodes that were already completed or in advanced stages continued to feature Henry's voice for Cleveland. The transition was handled with as much grace as these transitions can be handled with, and by most accounts, Zahir has performed the role with the kind of authenticity that his hiring was intended to produce. The broader conversation about white voice actors playing characters of color did not fully resolve itself with these individual casting decisions. It opened up questions about creative intent, about the nature of voice performance, about whether the characters themselves carried any inherent racial meaning, or whether the race of a voice actor was separate from the quality of the performance they gave. These questions don't have clean answers, and the industry continues to work through their implications. What the Cleveland recast contributed to Family Guy's specific history is a chapter in which the show, responding to a genuine cultural moment, made a change that reflected a meaningful principle about who gets to give voice to whose experience. Whether the show's writers' rooms, its creative leadership, and its broader production structure reflected similar principles was a harder question, and one that the casting of Zahir, by itself, could only partially answer. In June of 2020, in the weeks following the murder of George Floyd and the national reckoning with structural racism that followed, Mike Henry wrote a post on social media announcing that he was stepping away from the role of Cleveland Brown on Family Guy. Henry, who is white, had voiced the character since the show's premiere in 1999. His post was clear and direct. He said that the role of a black man should be played by a black actor, and that he hoped to be part of the process of helping find the right person to take over the character. Several other animated shows made similar announcements around the same time. The voice actress for Dr. Hibbert on The Simpsons, a black character previously voiced by a white performer, was replaced. Characters on Big Mouth and Central Park were also recast. The announcements came within a few weeks of each other, suggesting both genuine individual decisions and a broader collective recognition within the animation industry that a long-standing practice required examination. The context for these decisions was significant. The argument that black characters in animation should be voiced by black performers had been made for years by performers, scholars, and advocates for representation in entertainment media. The practice of white performers voicing black characters was historically tied to a tradition of minstrelsy and racial caricature that had informed early American animation, and while the connection to contemporary animated shows was not direct in most cases, the practice had persisted partly through institutional inertia and partly because voice acting casting had never been held to the same representational standards as on-screen casting. Cleveland Brown's specific history as a character made the Henry to Zahir transition particularly visible. Cleveland had been prominent enough in Family Guy to receive his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. The show followed Cleveland after he moved back to his hometown of Stool Bend, Virginia, remarried, and started a new family. It was a family sitcom with a predominantly black main cast, and it had aired for 4 seasons on Fox before ending due to declining ratings. During its entire run, the title character had been voiced by Mike Henry, a white man from Virginia who had developed the voice from early in Family Guy's development. The Cleveland Show's cancellation had generated some discussion at the time about whether a family sitcom with a black lead could succeed on Fox, and whether the particular version of Cleveland Brown that Henry had developed and the broader creative vision of the show authentically represented the communities it was depicting. These were questions without clean answers, and they were questions the entertainment industry was not quite ready to engage with frontally in 2013. The search for Henry's replacement proceeded through what Family Guy's casting directors described as an extensive process. They were looking for someone who could match the character's established voice profile closely enough that the transition would not be jarring, and who was black, and who could handle the performance requirements of a long-running animation series. The person they found was Arif Zahir. Zahir had built an audience on YouTube doing impressions, and among the voices in his repertoire was a remarkably accurate Cleveland Brown. He had not set out to use the YouTube videos as an audition. He was simply doing what impression performers do on the platform, putting up clips and building subscribers. Family Guy's team found him through those videos and brought him into a formal audition process. He got the job. Zahir began voicing Cleveland in season 19, which premiered in September 2020. His performance landed well with viewers, with many noting that his impression captured the character's vocal qualities in a way that felt authentic to the character's history, while also bringing something slightly different in texture and specificity. The recast was welcomed by many viewers and critics as an appropriate correction to a casting practice that had been wrong in principle, if not always in practice. It was also subject to the kind of critique that accompanies any symbolic gesture in the context of a larger structural problem. Recasting a character changes who provides the voice. It does not change how the character is written, what stories he's given, what aspects of his identity the show chooses to explore or ignore. Cleveland Brown had always been the most underdeveloped of Family Guy's recurring characters, not just relative to Peter and Stewie and Brian, but relative to almost any character who had a name and a designated place in the show's social world. His most prominent characterization across the show's first decade was that he was slow to anger, reliably mild in his responses to Peter's various disasters, and deeply patient in ways that could be read as characterological depth or could be read as a one-note running gag about the contrast between his even temper and Peter's explosive lack of it. He had been married twice within the show's continuity, divorced by his first wife under circumstances that involved Quagmire, and then featured in his own spin-off in which he remarried and started a new life in Virginia. None of this added up to a particularly richly drawn person. The casting of Zahir signaled that Family Guy was prepared to take the representational criticism seriously enough to make a concrete change. What the writing has done with Cleveland since the recast has been the subject of ongoing evaluation, and the verdict is not entirely in. There are episodes in which the character has been given material that engaged with his identity more thoughtfully than the show's earlier seasons managed. There are also episodes in which the older pattern has asserted itself, and Cleveland has been used primarily as a foil and a setup character for other people's jokes. Zahir himself has spoken about the complexity of his position with notable thoughtfulness. He arrived in a role that was already formed, with an established history and an established audience, at a moment when the cultural context around that role had shifted significantly. He was not being asked simply to voice a cartoon character. He was being asked to carry the weight of a representational conversation, to serve as evidence that the show had engaged seriously with the critique of its casting practices, and to do all of this while delivering jokes consistently enough to survive the performance standards of a show in its 20th season. He has managed this, and the management has been largely graceful. The Cleveland recast is part of a broader story about representation in American animation that was moving rapidly in the early 2020s and has continued to evolve since. The question of who voices whom and why, and what responsibility animated shows have to the communities whose members they depict, is not a question that any single casting decision fully resolves. It is an ongoing negotiation, and Family Guy's participation in it, however imperfect and however driven partly by external pressure rather than internal conviction, has been substantive enough to be worth acknowledging. Section 11. The Writers' Strikes and What They Cost. Family Guy has never operated in a stable, undisrupted creative environment. This is one of the less discussed but more significant facts about the show's history, because creative continuity matters in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to observe. A show that is repeatedly interrupted, that loses writers, that rebuilds its staff from scratch, that operates under the pressure of not knowing how long it will continue to exist, is a different kind of creative product from a show that has a stable, long-serving team and a secure future. Family Guy had two major disruptions from Writers Guild of America strikes, one in 2007 and one in 2023. Both were genuinely significant to the show's creative arc. Neither is fully accounted for in the public discussion of what happened to the show's quality across its many seasons. The 2007 WGA strike was the first major work stoppage by television writers since 1988. It began on the 5th of November 2007, after negotiations between the WGA and the major studios and networks broke down over compensation for digital distribution and residuals from DVD sales. These were significant issues. The entertainment industry was in the middle of a technology-driven transformation that was changing how content was distributed and consumed, and the existing compensation structures had not been updated to reflect the new economic realities. McFarlane was a committed WGA member and a visible supporter of the strike action. He joined picket lines. He used his public platform to advocate for the writer's position. He was, by multiple accounts, one of the more vocal and active creative voices in support of the strike in the animation community. The complication for Family Guy was that Fox had broadcast rights to episodes that had been completed or were in advanced stages of production before the strike began. Under their contractual arrangements, the network had the legal right to air those episodes even if McFarlane himself was on the picket line and had not given his final creative approval to them. Fox exercised that right. They aired 2 episodes of Family Guy during the strike period, Padre de Familia and Peter's Daughter, without McFarlane's sign-off. His response, quoted in reporting from that time, was that Fox had the legal right to do it, but that it was, in his description, a colossal move, and that the decision would be unfortunate and damaging to their relationship if they went through with it. They went through with it. This moment was significant not just as a data point in the McFarlane-Fox relationship, but as a concrete instance of the tension between a creator's authority over their creative work and a network's contractual authority over the product as intellectual property. McFarlane had built this show. He voiced the central characters. His creative sensibility had shaped every element of what it was. And the network could legally air episodes of it against his explicit wishes because they owned it. The strike ended on the 12th of February, 2008, after approximately 100 days. Production on Season 6 resumed, but the season had been shortened to 12 episodes from its planned length, and the disruption to the writing staff's rhythm and continuity was real. Television writers work on extended schedules, planning story arcs weeks and months in advance. developing internal momentum that is hard to rebuild quickly after a long break. The episodes produced after the strike feel, to careful viewers who have compared them, slightly different from the ones before it. The 2023 WGA strike was even more extensive in its impact. It began on the 2nd of May 2023, after negotiations over a new contract with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers broke down. The issues this time included compensation in the streaming era, minimum staffing levels for writers' rooms, and the use of artificial intelligence to generate or rewrite scripts. This last issue was new and significant. The rise of large language models capable of producing functional television scripts was something the creative community was taking very seriously, and the WGA was attempting to establish contractual protections against the replacement of human writers with automated systems. MacFarlane, along with all four of the showrunners for Family Guy and American Dad, Rich Appel, Alex Sulkin, Brian Boyle, and Matt Weitzman, left active work on their shows immediately. MacFarlane was photographed on picket lines. He issued public statements supporting the strikers. He had done this before, and he was doing it again. The SAG-AFTRA actors' strike began on the 14th of July, 2023, compounding the disruption. With both writers and actors on strike simultaneously, American film and television production effectively shut down. The two strikes together constituted the longest and most disruptive Hollywood work stoppage in decades. Shows in various stages of production were paused, pushed back, or canceled entirely. Family Guy Season 22 was shortened to 15 episodes, down from the standard 20. The show's production schedule was disrupted in ways that required rebuilding creative momentum for the subsequent season. The 2023 and 2024 television seasons were shorter across the board for essentially all affected shows. What these two strikes mean for Family Guy specifically, viewed together, is that the show has been through more creative disruption than its continuous production run might suggest. It was canceled twice. It lost its original writing staff during the hiatus years. It came back to a rebuilt room. It was hit by a major work stoppage in the middle of Season 6 that shortened the season and broke the rhythm of production. It gradually lost the deep involvement of its creator in day-to-day operations. It was hit by an even more extensive work stoppage in 2023. Each of these disruptions cost something that cannot be easily replaced. The cumulative cost across 25 years of production is a significant part of the explanation for why the show is what it is today compared to what it was in its first 3 seasons. The 2007 Writers Guild of America strike lasted from the 5th of November 2007 to the 12th of February 2008, 100 days. The dispute was primarily about residual payments, specifically how writers would be compensated when their work was distributed through new digital platforms. The studios took the position that digital distribution was too new and too uncertain to be subject to the residual structures that governed DVD and broadcast distribution. The writers took the position that work is work and compensation for it should follow the work wherever it goes. The strike shut down scripted television production across the American entertainment industry. Shows that were in the middle of producing seasons had their episode orders cut. Shows in development were put on hold. The late-night talk shows went dark or pivoted to unscripted formats. The daytime and evening drama landscape was significantly disrupted. The broader economic impact, by some estimates, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Family Guy had been in production on its 6th season when the strike began. MacFarlane shut down production on both Family Guy and American Dad, his other Fox animated series. He joined the writers on the picket line, which was visible and covered in entertainment trade media, and he made public statements that framed his support for the strike in terms of principle rather than calculation. Writers, he said, were the people who actually made television. The studios were attempting to establish a precedent for digital distribution that would systematically reduce writers' compensation as the entertainment landscape shifted toward the internet. He was not going to help them do that. Fox made a decision during the strike that created genuine conflict. The network chose to air 3 completed Family Guy episodes that had been finished before the work stoppage began. Fox technically had the right to air completed episodes it owned. The episodes had already been delivered and paid for. There was no contractual mechanism preventing their broadcast, but airing them over MacFarlane's explicit objection while the show's creator was on a picket line supporting the people who wrote them, was a provocative choice. MacFarlane described the decision publicly as a betrayal. The network made no public apology. The strike ended with a negotiated agreement that was, by the assessment of most WGA members, imperfect. It established the principle that writers were entitled to residuals from digital distribution. The specific rates that were negotiated were criticized by some as insufficient to make up for what writers had already lost to the growth of streaming. The argument that the deal should have been better was made vigorously by those who held it, and with some justice. Production resumed. The 6th season was completed with a reduced episode count, and the 7th season picked up the work that the strike had interrupted. The creative rhythm of the show, whatever its condition had been before the strike, had been disrupted in ways that were difficult to quantify but that experienced television writers consistently describe as significant. The momentum of a writer's room, the accumulated context of a season's worth of story, discussions, and joke development and character work does not survive a 100-day pause without losing something. The 2023 WGA strike was larger in scope and longer in duration. It lasted approximately 148 days, from May 2nd through the 27th of September, 2023. It occurred simultaneously with a Screen Actors Guild AFTRA strike, which began in July 2023 and lasted until November 2023, making it the first time both writers and actors had been on strike simultaneously since 1960. The combined work stoppage was the most significant labor action in Hollywood in over 6 decades. The issues in 2023 were familiar but had been intensified by the specific economics of the streaming era. The growth of streaming platforms as the dominant delivery mechanism for television had created a situation in which writers were being paid less while studios were generating more value from their work. The mini-room practice, in which writing staffs were assembled briefly to break a story and then dispersed before production began, was a specific mechanism for reducing writers' per-episode compensation by fragmenting the production timeline. The minimum staffing requirements that had historically guaranteed a certain number of writers per show were being eroded. Artificial intelligence was on the table in a way it had not been in 2007. The studios wanted maximum flexibility to use AI tools in the writing process, including as generators of first drafts that human writers would then revise. Writers wanted explicit limitations on these uses, both because they were concerned about being replaced by AI and because they understood that revision of AI-generated material would be compensated differently from original creation. The negotiation over AI was contentious and was one of the last issues to be resolved in the final agreement. MacFarlane was again on the picket line. His 2023 statements about the strike were more forceful than what he had said in 2007, and they were more explicitly connected to his views about corporate behavior and economic inequality. He said that the studio's approach to the negotiation reflected a fundamental contempt for the people who made television, that the institutions were attempting to systematically reduce the share of value that went to creative labor while increasing returns to capital. He used language that was, by Hollywood standards, notably direct. The American Dad showrunners Brian Boyle and Matt Weitzman also walked out. The Family Guy showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin joined them. The production company 20th Television, which produced both shows for Fox, was informed that none of the principals would return to work while the strike was ongoing. The settlement, reached in September 2023 for the WGA and November 2023 for SAG-AFTRA, included meaningful gains on several of the primary issues. Minimum staffing requirements were strengthened. AI provisions were established, including requirements that studios disclose to writers when AI-generated material was being used, and limitations on using AI to reduce writer compensation. Residual structures were updated in ways that attempted to capture more of the value being generated by streaming. As with the 2007 agreement, opinions about whether the 2023 settlement was sufficient varied. The studios claimed they had made significant concessions. Writers and their advocates said the concessions, while real, fell short of what was needed to reverse the economic deterioration of the previous decade. Both things were probably true. Family Guy's production resumed with season 22 after the settlement. The disruption to the production calendar was significant enough that the season aired on a delayed schedule, with episodes distributed across the calendar year in a pattern that was partly driven by the need to catch up on production time lost to the strike. What the two strikes together reveal about Family Guy is something worth naming directly. The show exists within a labor system, and the terms of that system determine the working conditions of every writer who sits in its writer's room, every animator who draws its characters, every voice actor who brings those characters to life. The controversies about offensive content and banned episodes and legal battles are the public face of the show's history. The labor conditions under which the show is produced are the material reality that underpins every episode. MacFarlane's consistent willingness to disrupt production, to absorb the commercial and professional costs of supporting strike action, is part of the show's story that rarely gets told, alongside the scandals and the fights. It is part of the story nonetheless. Section 12. The Renewal Machine, the Ratings Collapse, and the Show That Cannot Die. The story of Family Guy's ratings over its lifetime is one of the most dramatic narratives in the history of American broadcast television. Not because the decline is unique. Lots of shows have declined over long runs. The drama is in the scale of the decline and in the almost complete disconnect between what the numbers say and the show's continued existence and ongoing expansion. Start at the beginning. The premiere episode, which aired after Super Bowl 33 inches, January of 1999, drew approximately 22 million viewers. That number is inflated by the Super Bowl time slot, but the underlying audience was real. The first season averaged around 8 million households per episode. That was enough to rank the show 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings for the year, which was a solid and respectable performance for a new animated series. The cancellation years and the Adult Swim revival are best understood as a reset rather than a continuation of the original trajectory. When Season 4 premiered in May of 2005, it averaged around 7.9 million viewers. That was a substantial drop from the first season's 12.8 million, but it was also a show returning after 3 years of absence to an audience that had kept its memory alive through reruns and DVDs. 7.9 million was actually a strong number for a show coming back from the dead. From that point, the decline was gradual, sustained, and largely uninterrupted. Season 5 maintained numbers close to Season 4. Season 6 showed a measurable drop. Season 7 dropped further. The trend line from Season 4 onward was consistently downward, with occasional slight recoveries but no season that reversed the overall direction. By Season 13, which ran from 2014 to 2015, the average viewership had fallen to 5.86 million. That was a loss of roughly 2 million viewers from the Season 4 peak in less than a decade. It was a significant number, but the show was still pulling 5+ million people per episode, which in the 2014 television landscape was not embarrassing. The deterioration accelerated as the show entered its 20s. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the key adult 18 to 49 demographic that advertisers use to price their commercial time. This was not a slight decline from Season 13. This was a collapse, from 5.8 million to 1.3 million in 6 seasons. The show had lost 3/4 of its already reduced audience in 6 years. Season 23 averaged just 723,000 viewers. Less than 750,000 people were watching new Family Guy episodes on the night they aired. For comparison, the show's premiere episode had been watched by 22 million people. The episode average at Season 23 was about 3% of that premiere number. 97% of the audience that had watched Family Guy when it first aired was no longer watching its current episodes. The network's scheduling decisions reflected this reality. For most of its run, Family Guy had been a centerpiece of Fox's Sunday night animation domination block, a lineup that at its peak included The Simpsons, Family Guy, American Dad, and other animated comedies. Sunday night primetime on a major broadcast network is valuable real estate. In 2019, Family Guy was moved from the 9 o'clock hour to the 9:30 time slot, a signal that its place in the lineup was no longer as secure as it had been. Then, for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, the show was moved off Sunday night entirely. It was placed on Wednesday nights. Wednesday is the night that broadcast television assigns to shows it no longer considers headliners, shows that need to air somewhere but don't merit the most competitive slots. It was the first time Family Guy had aired on a weeknight since its troubled original run in 2001 and 2002, when Fox was moving it around in the desperate scheduling pattern that eventually led to its first cancellation. Being moved from Sunday to Wednesday is, in the unwritten language of broadcast television scheduling, a demotion. It means the network no longer thinks of you as appointment television. It means you're filling a slot rather than commanding one. And yet the show continues. And not just continues, but is being actively extended. In January of 2023, Fox renewed Family Guy for its 22nd and 23rd seasons despite the cratering ratings. In April of 2025, a major renewal deal was announced that extended the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. 15 episodes per season. The show that once aired after the Super Bowl will apparently still be producing episodes in its 30th year. The explanation for why a show with these ratings continues to get renewed is not mysterious. Animated shows are significantly cheaper to produce than live-action programs. No expensive sets to build and maintain. No large cast of on-screen actors requiring on-set time and physical production infrastructure. The voice actors record in booths in short sessions. The animation is handled by overseas studios that have been producing this kind of work efficiently for decades. The per-episode cost of Family Guy is a fraction of a live-action drama of comparable length. On top of the production cost advantage, Family Guy has an extensive afterlife in syndication and streaming. It airs in reruns on Adult Swim, on FXX, on Comedy Central, and in various international markets. In the United States, it streams on Hulu. Internationally, it generates licensing revenue from dozens of markets. Merchandise has been sold continuously since the show's revival in 2005 and continues to generate revenue from t-shirts, toys, video games, and other products. The first-run ratings, the number of people watching a new Family Guy episode on Wednesday night on Fox, are almost beside the point in terms of the business calculation. They represent one revenue stream among many, and in the overall economic model of the show, they're no longer the dominant one. The dominant revenue stream is the catalog, the 20-plus years of existing episodes being watched on streaming platforms and rerun channels by people who discovered the show years ago and continue to return to it. This dynamic, a show whose new episodes generate relatively modest returns, but whose existing catalog generates substantial ongoing revenue, is increasingly common in the streaming era. Disney's acquisition of the Fox Entertainment assets gave it ownership of a show with 25-plus years of catalog and a brand recognition that extends globally. From Disney's perspective, the marginal cost of continuing to produce new Family Guy episodes is low, and the marginal benefit, in terms of maintaining the brand and generating content for streaming platforms, is meaningful. In 2009, Family Guy received a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series, becoming the first animated show to receive that specific nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. Not even The Simpsons, the most critically acclaimed animated comedy in television history, had received that honor. The nomination was genuine recognition that the show, at its peak, was being taken seriously as one of the best comedies on American television. MacFarlane's reaction to that nomination was characteristically self-aware. He said publicly that it made no sense for Family Guy to receive a nomination that The Simpsons had never received, and that he found the entire Emmy system somewhat baffling as a result. The show that airs today, watched by fewer people than live in many medium-sized cities, scheduled on a night it was never meant to occupy, produced by teams working at a remove from the creative vision that built it, is connected to that legacy through the characters on screen and the voice of their creator in the recording booth. The connection is real. The distance from what the show was is also real. Every great thing gets older. Not all great things become something unrecognizable in the process. Family Guy is one of those that did, and the story of how it got there is the story of every scandal, every controversy, every creative decision, every labor dispute, every network fight, every public argument with other shows, and every private frustration of a creator watching his life's work continue past the point where he would have ended it. You have been sitting with all of it tonight. The stories that made news and the stories that happened quietly behind the scenes. The scandals that defined the show's public image and the scandals that said something about its private struggles. The controversies that were about art and the ones that were about commerce. The ones that the show deserved and the ones that found it unfairly. Family Guy started with a hangover and a missed flight and 22 million people watching a family they'd never met. Whatever it ends with, whenever that comes, the distance between those two moments is one of the most argued about stretches of ground in the history of American television. The federal government received nearly 200,000 complaints about it. Foreign governments banned it. Its creator publicly wished it was on a different network. Its most beloved character died and came back in 3 weeks. A comedian sued over a cleaning woman mopping in a pornographic context. A cartoon dog's death trended on Twitter for days. An episode about a woman's reproductive choice has been sitting on a shelf, unaired in America, for 15 years. If you made it to the end of this one, that means something. Drop a like if the video earned it, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment if any of this landed somewhere that kept you awake a little longer than you expected. Sleep well. Script for Uncle Guy lore: fall asleep to every Family Guy scandal. There is something almost stubborn about the way Family Guy has persisted. The numbers do not make a flattering picture. The show that premiered in January of 1999 to an audience of approximately 22 million viewers currently airs to audiences measured in the hundreds of thousands. The movement from one number to the other is not a gentle decline. It is the kind of collapse that, in almost any other commercial context, would have resulted in termination years ago. The 22 million who watched the premiere were inflated by the Super Bowl time slot, as everyone acknowledged at the time. But the first season's average of approximately 12.8 million households was genuine audience. The show had found real people who came back every week because they wanted to. That number held reasonably well through the early seasons and through the revival, even as it began a slow decline in the show's middle period. When Season 4 returned in 2005, on the strength of the Adult Swim revival and DVD sales momentum, it averaged around 7.9 million viewers. That was significantly below the first season, but it was a show coming back from 3 years of cancellation, and 7.9 million was a real and respectable audience. By Season 13, running from 2014 to 2015, the average had fallen to 5.86 million. A loss of 2 million viewers over 9 seasons was meaningful, but not catastrophic. The show was still pulling nearly 6 million people per episode. Then the floor dropped out. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million viewers. Season 23 averaged 723,000. The show that had once been one of Fox's most valuable primetime properties was drawing fewer viewers per episode than the population of several major American cities. Indianapolis has about 900,000 people. Family Guy Season 23 was watched by fewer people than live in Indianapolis. The network responded to these numbers in the way networks respond to declining ratings. They moved the show. In 2019, the shift was from the 9 o'clock Sunday hour to the 9:30 position, a small demotion, a signal of reduced priority. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, the shift was more significant. Family Guy was removed from the Sunday animation domination block entirely and moved to Wednesday nights. Wednesday, a weeknight. The last time Family Guy had aired on a weeknight was during its troubled original run in 2001 and 2002, when Fox was shuffling it around in a pattern of scheduling dysfunction that preceded its first cancellation. And yet, in January of 2023, Fox renewed Family Guy for seasons 22 and 23. In April of 2025, a major renewal was announced that extended the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 broadcast year, 15 episodes per season. A show with 723,000 weekly viewers was being locked in for years of additional production. To understand why, you have to stop thinking about television the way television was understood in 1999 and start thinking about it the way it actually works in the mid-2020s. In 1999, a television show's commercial value was almost entirely determined by its first-run ratings. The people who watched a show when it aired were the people who saw the commercials. The commercial revenue generated by those viewings was the primary income stream. A show with declining ratings was a show losing the ability to charge advertisers for eyeballs, which was a show losing its reason to exist from the network's perspective. That model began changing in the 2000s and accelerated dramatically in the 2010s with the rise of streaming. By the early 2020s, the relationship between first-run broadcast ratings and a show's total commercial value had been substantially decoupled. Shows that performed modestly in first-run broadcast could still generate enormous value through streaming, through syndication, through international licensing, and through what television economists call catalog value, the worth of an extensive library of existing episodes in a market where streaming platforms were competing intensively for content. Family Guy's catalog is massive, over 400 episodes across more than 2 decades. It includes the seasons that critics and fans consider great and the seasons they consider disappointing. But from a streaming platform's perspective, the critical assessment of individual episodes is less relevant than the sheer volume of available content and the recognition of the brand. Hulu pays for the right to stream Family Guy. The payment is not calibrated to whether Season 22 got better reviews than Season 10. It is calibrated to what the property is worth as a catalog in the context of a competitive streaming market. The merchandise ecosystem that has built up around the show over 25 years is real and generates ongoing revenue. T-shirts, mugs, toys, video games, theme park appearances, brand licensing for advertising and promotional contexts. None of this is tied to how many people watched a new episode last Wednesday. It is tied to the cultural presence the show built during its peak years and has maintained through continued production. The international licensing market is also significant. Family Guy airs in dozens of countries. Different markets are at different stages of their own relationship to the show's history. Some markets that received the show later are currently watching seasons that American audiences watched years ago, which means the show is simultaneously in decline in its home market and still building its audience in others. Against all of this, the cost of producing a new season of Family Guy is relatively modest by network television standards. No sets to build, no location shoots, no physical production infrastructure. Voice actors record in booths. Animation is handled by offshore studios that have been producing this content efficiently for years. The incremental cost of producing 15 new episodes of Family Guy is manageable against the total revenue the show's existence generates. This is the arithmetic of continuation. The show persists not because the Wednesday night ratings justify its existence in the traditional sense, but because the total return on the investment of producing new episodes remains positive when you account for all the revenue streams that extend beyond those Wednesday night numbers. MacFarlane has been asked about the show's future in interviews over the years, and his answers have had a particular quality to them that is worth noting. He has never described Family Guy as something he is burning to continue. He has talked about it in terms of its commercial utility, the revenue it generates, funds causes he cares about, like environmental conservation through organizations including Rainforest Trust. He has talked about its cultural function as entertainment for people who enjoy it. He has not, in any interview I have found, described a feeling of urgent creative necessity around continuing to produce the show. He is not, in his own telling, a man with a story he desperately needs to tell about Peter Griffin that he hasn't told yet. This is not the same as indifference. MacFarlane clearly cares about the quality of what gets made under his name and his supervision. He shows up, he voices his characters, he is involved in the show's creative direction to a degree that exceeds the minimum required by his contractual obligations. But the passionate necessity that drove him at 25 to stay up through the night, producing a pilot on $50,000, the feeling of having something to say that the world needed to hear, has been transmuted by time and success and accumulating seasons into something more like professional commitment. The show that was supposed to be too dangerous for American prime time, that generated congressional hearings and federal complaints and international bans, is now a reliable corner of the broadcasting landscape, a familiar presence in the Wednesday night lineup, something that people are mildly pleased to see when they come across it and not particularly surprised by. The scandals that defined it are part of the historical record. The banned episode still hasn't aired in America. The South Park feud is documented and debated. Brian died and came back, and the whole thing is a footnote now. Carol Burnett's lawsuit was decided years ago. The PTC filed its last major campaign against the show somewhere in the mid-2010s, and the energy went out of the fight. The creator is mostly building things for a different network. The character they killed is voiced by a different actor. 2 writers' strikes have come and gone. The ratings have collapsed. The show is still there. There is something almost admirable about the stubbornness of it, the refusal to go quietly that has characterized the show since the Adult Swim reruns started in 2003, and the DVD sales shocked Fox into reconsidering. Family Guy was not supposed to survive. It survived anyway. It was not supposed to recover from 2 cancellations. It recovered anyway. It was not supposed to outlast the campaigns of the most organized broadcast censorship operation in American history. It outlasted them anyway. Whether the show that exists in its 30th year is the same show that surprised the world in 1999 is a question worth asking and not entirely possible to answer cleanly. The characters are the same names. The voices are largely the same voices, with the exception of Cleveland. The Rhode Island city is the same city. The comedy style is recognizably derived from what MacFarlane built in those early years. But the specific energy, the feeling of creative risk that accompanied the best episodes of the first several seasons, the sense that the people making the show were surprised and delighted by what they were getting away with, that quality has faded in the way that qualities fade from things that have been running for a very long time. The scandals, paradoxically, are what kept the energy alive the longest. Each new controversy was evidence that the show was still capable of surprising someone, still capable of going somewhere that generated a genuine reaction rather than comfortable indifference. The complaints to the FCC, the foreign government bans, the lawsuits, the social media firestorms, all of these were proof of relevance, proof that the show was still touching something live rather than operating purely on the momentum of past significance. In April 2025, with the renewal through season 27 locked in, Family Guy is guaranteed to reach its 30th anniversary still in production. 30 years. From a hangover and a travel agent's error and a 25-year-old animator with $50,000 and an idea about a man and his talking dog, through 2 cancellations and a miraculous revival and more controversies than most shows generate in 100 years, and a ratings collapse so complete it would have killed any other property a decade ago. The show has refused to stay dead since the first time anyone tried to kill it. At this point, it seems like a policy. And that is the full story of Family Guy's scandals, stretched across a quarter-century of broadcasting history and cultural argument. From the Parent Television Council filing complaint after complaint with the federal government to the Venezuelan government banning an episode about Brian Griffin and marijuana. From the legal battle over a cleaning woman in a porn store to the 100,000 people who signed a petition for a cartoon dog. From the banned abortion episode sitting on a shelf to the creator wishing his show was on a different network while still cashing the checks. All of it, every chapter, connected by the thread of a show that somehow could not be canceled and could not be silenced and could not be made to behave. There is something almost mythological about how it persisted. If you made it to the end of this, sit with that for a moment. The room is quiet. The night is doing what it does. Nothing needs your attention right now. Just rest, and let the strange, stubborn history of one animated family settle into its place alongside everything else you know. Sleep well. If this video was worth your time, a like or subscribe makes a real difference to the channel. And leave a comment wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is there. You being here matters. Script for Uncle Guy lore fall asleep to every Family Guy scandal. Extended material, additional depth. On the animated comedy wars of the 2000s, the South Park critique of Family Guy landed in a specific cultural moment that is worth understanding more completely. By 2006, adult animated comedy had developed enough of a history on American television that it was possible to identify competing schools of thought within the genre, competing philosophies about what animation could and should do for adult audiences. The Simpsons represented one tradition. The show had, especially in its first 8 or 9 seasons, established that animated comedy could achieve genuine satirical and emotional depth. Episodes like Homer's Enemy, Lisa the Iconoclast, and Last Exit to Springfield demonstrated that a cartoon about a dysfunctional family could address real questions about American institutions, about the relationship between idealism and reality, about what it meant to be working class in a country that celebrated individual success while structuring most people's lives around constraint. The show's best years were years in which the humor and the pathos worked together, in which the jokes were funny and the emotional stakes were real. By 2006, The Simpsons was in its 17th season and widely agreed to have passed that peak. The debates about when The Simpsons had gone wrong and why were already a standard fixture of internet discussion among animation fans. Seasons 9, 10, and 12 were all cited by different people as the moment things had shifted. Nobody was making those arguments at season 17. The Simpsons by 2006 was an institution rather than a creative force, and the torch of culturally significant adult animation had been passed somewhere else. The two candidates were South Park and Family Guy. They were genuinely different shows, with genuinely different ideas about what their respective mediums were for. South Park's news cycle responsiveness, its willingness to take on any subject the writers found interesting or important, its tendency to conclude its episodes with a moral argument that was sometimes sincere and sometimes deliberately undercut, gave it a quality that critics who valued argumentation in comedy found satisfying. Family Guy's cutaway-heavy, story-secondary format gave it a different quality, one that felt more like late-night comedy club material, assembled into 22 minutes high hit rate on individual jokes, less investment in the through line. Parker and Stone's attack on Family Guy was simultaneously a genuine aesthetic argument and a competitive positioning. By declaring that Family Guy represented an inferior approach to animation comedy, they were also implying that South Park represented a superior one. The implication served their interests. It wasn't therefore wrong, but the self-interest was visible. MacFarlane has been consistently generous about South Park in ways that have sometimes surprised people who expected him to be more defensive. He has said that he thinks South Park does certain things better than Family Guy. He has acknowledged that the show's different approaches to comedy lead to different results, and that some of those results favor the South Park model. He has been honest about the fact that the cutaway gag format has limitations that straight narrative construction doesn't have. This generosity is either genuine or a sophisticated rhetorical strategy. It may be both. The thing that neither Parker nor MacFarlane typically says in these conversations, though it is visible in the audience data, is that Family Guy consistently outrated South Park during the period of their most intense competitive relationship. South Park's critical prestige was higher. Family Guy's commercial performance was stronger. This is a dynamic that comedy frequently produces, where the show that critics consider more substantive and serious is the show that a smaller number of people actually choose to watch each week. Both numbers matter, but they measure different things, and conflating them produces confusion about what a show's success actually means. The manatee joke from Cartoon Wars is now more than 15 years old, and its longevity as a cultural reference says something about how well it captured something true about Family Guy's habits at their worst. The show's best cutaways are not random. They are precisely targeted. They catch audiences at specific angles of surprise. They derive their comedy from a very exact calibration of expectation and violation. But the show's less inspired cutaways are, genuinely, interchangeable in a way the best ones are not. They could be placed in different episodes without loss. They exist to fill time and generate some quantity of amusement without aspiring to the specific, necessary quality of the best comedy writing. Parker and Stone identified this and named it, and the name stuck because it was accurate about a real thing. That does not make it the complete picture of what Family Guy is, but it is part of the picture, and it remains the most quoted single judgment about the show's creative limitations in its own era. On the Carol Burnett case and the limits of parody, the legal framework that protected Family Guy in the Carol Burnett case deserves more examination than the headline result typically receives, because the principles it applied are not obviously stable, and the protection they provide is not unlimited. Parody in American copyright law descends from the First Amendment principle that commentary on creative works is itself a form of creative expression that copyright cannot simply absorb and eliminate. The logic is that the entire project of critical and transformative culture depends on the ability to engage with existing works, to imitate them, to place them in new contexts, to use their recognizable features as the raw material for new commentary. If the creator of an original work could simply prohibit all imitation of their work, they would effectively be able to prevent critique and commentary, which is a result the First Amendment will not tolerate. The protection has limits. Parody must genuinely comment on the original work, not simply use the original work as a convenient vehicle for some other comedic purpose that has nothing to do with the original. The clearest version of this distinction in the Burnett case is the argument that the charwoman in a porn store joke was not a comment on the charwoman, or on the Carol Burnett show, or on Carol Burnett's career. It was a joke that used the charwoman's visual identity to create an incongruous image. The incongruity was the joke. The character was just the vehicle. The Ninth Circuit found this sufficient. The reasoning, essentially, was that placing a recognizable figure from wholesome family entertainment in an explicitly sexual context was itself a kind of comment on the character, however crude the comment was. The pornographic context transformed the original's associations in a way that counted as transformative expression. This is a relatively broad reading of the parody doctrine. Narrower readings would have required more explicit commentary on the specific qualities of the charwoman, rather than simply using her recognizable image in an incongruous situation. The broader reading protects a larger range of creative practice, including the kinds of reference and repurposing that are central to how internet culture and contemporary comedy operate. It also means that the protection can cover things that are genuinely just appropriation, dressed in parody's clothes. Burnett's argument was not frivolous. The scene was not, by any reasonable standard, a work of criticism that would have enriched public understanding of the charwoman as a character or of the Carol Burnett show as a creative achievement. It was a quick joke that used a famous character's visual identity for a crude purpose. The legal protection that exists for this practice is real, but so is the reasonable discomfort that comes from recognizing that the practice is protected. MacFarlane and the Family Guy team were aware that they were operating close to a line in that scene, even if they ultimately came out on the protected side of it. The show's ongoing engagement with celebrity culture and entertainment history involves constant navigation of where fair use ends and appropriation begins, and the Burnett case is the clearest marker in the public record of where that navigation has led them into actual legal conflict. The principle established by the case that Family Guy's brand of satirical celebrity reference is protected under the First Amendment's parody doctrine has been invoked, at least implicitly, in defense of similar content in subsequent seasons. The show has continued to use recognizable figures and properties in ways that are sometimes genuinely parodic and sometimes closer to the appropriation end of the spectrum. The legal protection holds as long as the courts continue to apply the broad reading of parody doctrine that the Ninth Circuit applied in the Burnett case. On the writers and what the room was like. One element of the strike story that deserves its own extended treatment is what the writers' room culture of Family Guy was actually like during the show's peak years, and what it became as the original staff dispersed and new voices entered. MacFarlane assembled the original writing room with people he had relationships with from various stages of his career. Chris Sheridan had been a friend from MacFarlane's early days in Los Angeles and became one of the most important writers of the show's first 3 seasons. Danny Smith and Ricky Blitt had backgrounds in late-night television. Wellesley Wild would become a long-term collaborator whose fingerprints are on some of the most significant episodes across multiple seasons. The common quality of the original room was a shared sensibility, a specific kind of comic timing, and a specific appetite for risk that came from having worked together or from having been chosen by MacFarlane because they matched the sensibility he was developing. When the show was canceled in 2002 and those writers dispersed, what was lost was not just individual talent, but the accumulated chemistry of a specific group of people who had learned to work together and had collectively developed the show's specific voice. When the show returned in 2005 with a partially reconstituted room, some of those people came back. Others had moved on permanently. New people joined who had not been part of the original formation. The institutional knowledge that a writing room accumulates the understanding of what the show's humor sounds like when it's working and what it sounds like when it's not, the instinct for which direction a story should go when several directions are available, the unspoken agreements about which subjects are worth engaging with and how all of this is fragile, and it does not survive the kind of disruption that 2 cancellations and a 3-year hiatus produce. What returned in 2005 was a show with the same characters and the same premise, and a partially reconstituted team that was doing its best to recover something that had been partly lost. The writers' strike of 2007 added another disruption. Production stopped. The momentum broke. People worked on other projects during the hiatus. The room that returned in 2008 was picking up something it had set down, and the setting down and picking back up is never completely seamless. This is the material reality behind the critical narrative of Family Guy's decline. The show did not simply become less creative or less ambitious because its creator had lost interest or its writers had grown lazy. The institutional infrastructure that supports good comedy writing was disrupted repeatedly, and each disruption cost something that was not fully recoverable. The decline was not one person's failure. It was an accumulation of structural circumstances, each of which took something from the room's collective capacity, producing an output that was progressively less consistent with the standard the original team had set. MacFarlane has been characteristically honest about this, in his careful way. He has acknowledged the effect of the early cancellations on the writing staff. He has said that the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had been canceled in 2002. He has not made excuses. He has described the situation as accurately as someone inside it can describe it. The writers who have worked on the show in its later seasons are talented people doing difficult work. Writing comedy that will be viewed by an audience that has been watching the same characters for 20-plus years, finding angles of surprise in situations that have been explored many times, generating laughs from premises that have accreted years of expectation around them. This is genuinely hard, and the people doing it are not doing it badly. They are doing it under conditions that make doing it well substantially harder than it was at the beginning. The strikes they walked off for, in 2007 and in 2023, were partly fights for the conditions that make this kind of creative work sustainable over a career. The minimum staffing requirements and the residual structures and the AI provisions are not abstract policy questions. They are the material conditions that determine whether a person can spend 20 years working in a comedy writer's room, developing the specific knowledge and craft that only accumulates over time, or whether they have to leave after a few seasons because the economics no longer support their continued participation. MacFarlane's visible support for the writers during both strikes was, in part, a recognition of this. The show that exists is the product of the people who write it, and the people who write it need conditions under which they can sustain their craft across the years it takes to fully develop it. That is everything in this extended account. Every chapter accounted for, every argument laid out, every number on the table. The city that doesn't exist sleeps quietly. Peter Griffin is probably doing something he shouldn't. Brian is probably at the bar with a second drink he promised himself he wasn't going to order. Stewie has filed away his plans for world domination and is watching something on the television. Meg is in her room, existing with a quiet dignity that the show spent a decade pretending not to notice. And Chris is asleep, dreaming whatever gentle things he dreams. And somewhere, Seth MacFarlane, who was 25 years old when he first put them all on television, is almost certainly working on something. The night is soft. Everything is still. Sleep well. Additional content for Uncle Guy lore. Fall asleep to every Family Guy scandal. Closing reflection. What 25 years of controversy actually proves? There is a way of looking at every scandal in this script as a failure. A failure of taste, or of judgment, or of the network that aired it, or the creator who made it, or the cultural system that allowed it to keep going past the point where its better impulses were routinely evident. That reading is available, and it is not entirely wrong. There is another way of looking at it. Family Guy spent 25 years provoking the most organized, best-funded, most politically connected campaign of broadcast censorship in the history of American network television. It was attacked from the left and from the right. It was taken to court by one of the most beloved figures in the history of American comedy. It was condemned by foreign governments, including Venezuela's justice minister citing a single episode as evidence of American drug promotion. It had its creator publicly wish it was on a different network while he kept making it. It killed one of its most beloved characters on a Sunday in November and brought him back on a Sunday in December. It has a banned episode that has never aired in its country of origin, sitting on a shelf for 15 years. It is still on the air. The show that exists today is not the show that existed in 1999. Watch the early seasons back to back with the recent ones, and the distance between them is real, visible, and a little melancholy. The first 3 seasons have a specific quality, a creative excitement in them, the feeling of something being made by people who cannot quite believe they're getting away with it. That quality fades over long runs. It fades for almost everything. The later seasons have compensations, craft, familiarity, occasional flashes of the old genius, but the raw energy of the beginning is not there, and the absence is worth acknowledging honestly. What is also worth acknowledging is that the show's survival is not a passive accident. It is the result of choices made by MacFarlane, by the writers who stayed, by the audience that kept watching, by the network that kept renewing even when the ratings argued against it, by the legal team that defended the show in court, by the cast that kept showing up at the recording booth across 2 decades. All of those choices, made by real people with real alternatives, are what the show is. The controversies that surrounded those choices are the record of a culture negotiating with itself about what it would and would not tolerate. The negotiation is not over. It never is. But somewhere in the progression from 22 million viewers watching a new show premiere after the Super Bowl in 1999 to 700,000 watching it on Wednesday nights in its 23rd year, there is a story about American popular culture that is worth knowing. About what we decide to fight for and what we decide to let go. About the difference between a show's commercial life and its creative life. About how long an audience can keep something alive past the point when every institutional signal says it should have ended. Family Guy was canceled and came back, and then it was canceled again and came back again, and then it kept going through the strikes and the lawsuits and the FCC complaints and the foreign government bans and the death of the cartoon dog and the creator's public wish that it was somewhere else. And the fact that it is still there, still making episodes, still finding its way into the lives of people who watch it late at night in their rooms while the world outside is quiet, that is. In whatever modest and complicated way, something worth noting, sleep well. The night takes care of itself. Everything that needed to be figured out today has been figured out enough for now. Script for Uncle Guy lore, fall asleep to every Family Guy scandal. A note on the world, the show built. One of the things that tends to get overlooked in the conversation about Family Guy's controversies is the specific texture of the world the show created. The fictional Rhode Island city where the Griffins live has accumulated its own detailed internal geography over 25 seasons. There is the Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends gather. There is James Woods Regional High School, where Meg and Chris attend classes. There is the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery where Peter works. There are the neighbors whose houses connect to the Griffins by the specific suburban topography of their street. There is a whole population of recurring characters who have their own histories and their own corners of the town. The show built this world in the tradition of the long-running animated sitcom that preceded it, but it built it with a specific New England sensibility that is one of the quieter pleasures of the early seasons. Rhode Island is a real place with a real character, and the show's depiction of working-class New England life, the particular rhythms of bar culture and neighborhood gossip, and the kind of civic pride that involves rooting for sports teams as an expression of community belonging, was grounded in something actual. MacFarlane grew up in Connecticut. He spent his early adult years in Providence, where the Rhode Island School of Design is located. The sensibility he brought to the show's setting was not purely invented. It drew on specific, observed things about how a particular kind of American small city works, the relationships between neighbors who have known each other for years, the particular dynamics of working-class male friendship, the way a town generates its own small dramas that feel enormous to the people inside them. This groundedness is one of the things that made the early show feel different from pure absurdism. The cutaway gags were surreal and disconnected from ordinary life, but the frame from which they launched, the Griffin household and the city around it, had an anchoring specificity. Peter was not just any dumb character. He was a specific kind of American dad, with a specific history and a specific place in a specific community. Lois was not just any long-suffering wife. She was a person with a background of her own, a family she came from, a life before Peter that had shaped who she became. As the seasons accumulated, this specificity eroded. The city became less particular and more generic. The Griffins' relationships with their community became more peripheral. The show's world expanded in ways that served individual episode plots, but that made the underlying social geography of the place feel less real. The scandals that fill the show's history happened in this world. They happened in a place with a name and a postal code and a set of neighbors who have been watching each other's children grow up for 25 years. Whatever the show became in its later seasons, and however the controversies around it accumulated, the original world that MacFarlane built for these characters was a real piece of creative construction. It is worth acknowledging that alongside everything else, the scandals were never really about the place. They were about ideas, about lines and who drew them and who had the right to draw them. But they happened in a place that felt real enough to matter, and that realness is part of why the arguments around them carried the weight they did. You argue more intensely about what happens in a place that feels inhabited than about what happens in an abstract space. What the show built across its long run and its many controversies and its impossible survival, was a place, and whatever happens to it next more seasons, eventual cancellation, the slow, dignified fade that every long-running show eventually undergoes that place will have existed. It will be there in the archive, in the early seasons, in the moments where the world felt specific and the characters felt real and the comedy felt like it was coming from somewhere genuine. That is not nothing. In a medium full of shows that feel like they were assembled rather than created, made to specification rather than out of necessity, it is actually something significant. The night is long. The stories are told. The controversies are noted. Everything that needed to be said has been said. Sleep well. And if you are still here, still awake in whatever corner of the world you are watching from, then thank you. This was a long one, and you stayed with it. And that means something to the channel and to everyone who put the time in to make it. Leave a like if it was worth your time. Subscribe if you want more. Drop a comment with wherever you are watching from the city, the country, the time of night. It is a small thing, but knowing that this reaches people in different rooms and different time zones is one of the genuinely good things about making these. Take care of yourself. The world is still there when you wake up. Nothing needs to be figured out tonight.